Is it true that Muslims are allowed by the Quran to deceive any and all unbelievers, that is, all human beings who are not followers of Muhammad, when the Muslims are in a weaker position?
It was Muhammad who 1400 years ago unilaterally declared total war against all those who do not believe as he did, the unbelievers. He asserted repeatedly that the most important and fundamental art of war is deception. Hence taqiyya, after a passage from the Quran, is the Muhammadan Muslim doctrine and practice of self-protection, religious dissimulation, concealment, disguise, deception, subterfuge, whereby it is considered acceptable to conceal one's true beliefs and even identity in the face of perceived adversity. The above definition must be clearly explained. First, the concealment of one's beliefs does not mean an abandonment of these beliefs. The distinction between concealment and abandonment must be clearly understood. Second, the word beliefs and or convictions does not necessarily mean religious beliefs and or convictions only. Let us look at the taqiyya according to the Sunnis. Some Sunnis assert that al-taqiyya is an act of pure hypocrisy that serves to conceal the truth and reveal that which is the exact opposite of the truth. Furthermore, according to those Sunnis, al-taqiyya constitutes a lack of faith and trust in Allah, because the person who conceals his beliefs to spare himself from imminent danger is fearful of humans, when in fact he should be fearful of Allah only. As such, this person is a coward. Let us now look at Sunni sources in support of al-taqiyya. The following exposition will demonstrate the existence of al-taqiyya in the Quran, Hadith, Muhammad as well as his companions' custom. As usual, Sunni books will be used to further the argument. This is in keeping with our commitment to reveal the truth by showing that the Sunnis reject the Shia arguments, while their own books are replete, full, with the same ideologies that the Shia uphold. It is in similitude of the pot calling the kettle black. Although some Wahhabis staunchly argue their aforementioned statements and aggressively defame the Shia and refute their doctrines, they have failed to explain the validity of their argument vis-à-vis the existence of these same doctrines in their own books. Those who think that they are the true protectors of the Sunnah of Muhammad and the only guardians of the Islamic faith, how can they explain their own rejection of that which they are supposed to protect? Rejecting al-taqiyya is rejecting the Quran, as will be shown. Reference 1. Jalal al-Din al-Suyuti in his book Al-Durr al-Manthur fil Tafsir al-Ma'thur narrates Ibn Abbas, who is the most renowned and trusted narrator of tradition in the sight of the Sunnis, regarding his opinion of al-taqiyya in the Quranic verse. Surat Ali Imran 3.28. Let not the believers take for friends or helpers unbelievers, rather than believers. If any do that, in nothing will there be help from Allah, except by way of precaution that you may guard yourselves from them. Tattaqu. But Allah cautions you, tuqatan, to remember himself, for the final goal is to Allah. That Ibn Abbas said, al-taqiyya is with the tongue only. He who has been coerced into saying that which angers Allah, and his heart is comfortable, that is, his true faith has not been shaken, then saying that which we has been coerced to say will not harm him at all, because al-taqiyya is with the tongue only, not the heart. Reference 2. Ibn Abbas also commented on the above verse as narrated in Sunan al-Bayhaqi and al-Hakim's Mustadrak by saying, al-taqiyya is the uttering of the tongue, while the heart is comfortable with faith, which means that the tongue is permitted to utter any untruth in a time of need, as long as the heart is not affected and one is still a believer. Reference 3. Abu Bakr al-Razi in his book Ahkam al-Quran, volume 2, page 10, has explained the aforementioned verse by affirming that al-taqiyya should be used when one is afraid for life and or limb. In addition, he has narrated that Qatada said with regards to the above verse, it is permissible to speak words of unbelief when al-taqiyya is mandatory. When the followers of Muhammad are in a weak position vis-à-vis the unbelievers, or even other sects of Islam, or threatened and cannot defend themselves, they are then allowed to do whatever is expedient to survive, even if it meant breaking every prohibition in the Quran. The doctrine of al-taqiyya allows the followers of Muhammad to become short or long-term sleepers, to use deception, misinformation, disinformation, plant seeds of discord and sedition, and all other manners of lies to bring about the collapse of the entity being subverted, which is of course the government of the unbelievers, so that the Muslims can take over with minimum opposition or losses. It saves them from having to become martyrs for their faith. In today's terms, for instance, the followers of Muhammad put forth the following lies and misinformation: that jihad is actually the struggle of the spirit, that the extremists are the aberration and not the norm, that fundamentalists do not represent true Islam, that Islam is a religion of peace, even though almost 95% of all of today's world conflicts and acts of terror are instigated and perpetrated by Muslims, that Islam is a tolerant religion, when in fact all the unbelievers are not allowed to publicly and freely express their religious beliefs anywhere in almost 50 Islamic states in the world, that Islam is pro-democratic, when neither the women in Islam nor other non-believers are allowed even a semblance of freedoms or the rights of the dignity of man under the recognized and universal human rights charter, etc., etc. In the present day, just as they did in the past, fundamentalist Muhammadan Muslims use this theological loophole as a means of infiltration and subterfuge to absolve Muslim terrorists and members of suicide squads from looking like observant Muslims, so as to be able to blend among the populace of the nations they are targeting and not cause suspicion or attention to be paid to them. This process allows the Muhammadans, who are absolved of all wrongdoing, to temporarily bend to foreign authority, and are even allowed to make terms with it for as long as they are weak, until such time that they can overthrow or destroy it. The principle of taqiyya allows the ignorant Western and or unbeliever statesman to fall into the deadly trap of trusting the words, the signature, or any form of agreement made with a Muslim. He neither realizes nor conceives that all these procedures and agreements are totally meaningless, since the signatory to the agreement, the Muhammadan Muslim, has absolutely no intention of honoring them in the long run. They are only a means to an end, that is, the end of the gullible non-believer who signed them. When dealing with a Muslim statesman or diplomat, the real issue is not what he says or means, but actually what he intends to do in his heart, which is of course unfathomable. Muhammad repeatedly asserted that deception is one of the best strategies of waging war. We in the Western democracies and everywhere else in the world who are unbelievers are being deceived, subverted, and slowly destroyed from within and without by the followers of Muhammad, because our leaders do not comprehend or understand those they are dealing with.
While reading some of the commentaries explaining the Quranic verses, both in the Quran and the Hadiths, I was struck by a sentence which was repeated innumerable times, proclaiming that such and such an event happened, and then a verse was revealed. Can you explain this?
And then it was revealed is a mantra that permeates Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, and Tirmidhi hadiths, as well as Ibn Ishaq's biography of Muhammad. In hundreds upon hundreds of instances, an event had occurred or an action was taken or ordered by Muhammad, for which afterwards, that is after the event, a convenient and very appropriate revelation was descended, justifying or explaining it by an indisputable divine decree. In the cases of the Hebrew prophets, they predicted events beforehand, and then these predictions came to be true. This is the essence of prophecy. In Muhammad's case, almost none exist in such a manner, but are invariably prophesied after an event has occurred and in hindsight. The most remarkable, astounding, and disturbing realization that one faces after studying the hadiths, Ibn Ishaq Sirat Rasulullah, and most of the Mawdudi analysis of the revealed verses and surahs, is the enormous number of repeated mantras such as, and Allah revealed, or then it was revealed, or then Gabriel revealed, that fill them. In Bukhari hadith alone, there are more than 450 such hadiths. Here are a few of them to enlighten the listeners. Sahih al-Bukhari hadith 3.546, narrated by Abdullah bin Mas'ud. The Prophet said, whoever takes a false oath to deprive somebody of his property will meet Allah while he will be angry with him. Then Allah revealed, verily those who purchase a little gain at the cost of Allah's covenant and their oaths. Chapter 3.77. Al-Ash'ath declared, this verse was revealed concerning me. I had a well in the land of a cousin of mine. The Prophet asked me to bring witnesses to confirm my claim. I said, I don't have witnesses. He said, let the defendant take an oath then. I said, oh Allah's Apostle, he will take a false oath immediately. Then the Prophet mentioned the above narration, and then Allah revealed the verse to confirm what he had said. Sahih al-Bukhari hadith 6.38, narrated by Sahil bin Sa'd. The verse, and eat and drink until the white thread appears to you distinct from the black thread, was revealed, but of dawn was not revealed along with it. So some men, when intending to fast, used to tie their legs, one with white thread and the other with black thread, and would keep on eating till they could distinguish one thread from the other. Then Allah revealed, of dawn, whereupon they understood that meant the night and the day. Sahih al-Bukhari hadith 6.175, narrated by Ibn Abbas. When the verse, if there are 20 steadfast amongst you, they will overcome 200, chapter 8.65, was revealed, then it became obligatory for the Muslims that one Muslim should not flee from 10 non-Muslims. Then there was revealed, but now Allah has lightened your task, 8.66. So it became obligatory that 100 Muslims should not flee before 200 non-Muslims. Allah, it seems, did not realize that 20 of the followers of Muhammad could not possibly fight against 200 and win. So he changed his mind to reduce the odds to the more realistic 2-to-1 ratio. From Muslim Hadith, here are a few more. Sahih Muslim Hadith 1212, narrated by Aisha. The Prophet entered my house when a Jewess was with me, and she was saying, do you know that you would be put to the trial in the grave? The Messenger of Allah trembled on hearing this, and said, it is the Jews only who would be put to trial. Aisha said, we passed some nights, and then the Messenger of Allah said, do you know that it has been revealed to me you would be put to trial in the grave? Aisha said, I heard the Messenger of Allah seeking refuge from the torment of the grave after this. Sahih Muslim Hadith 1317, narrated by Al-Bara' ibn Azib. This verse was revealed in this way, guard the prayers and the Asr prayer. We recited it in this very way as long as Allah desired. Allah then abrogated it and changed it to guard the prayers and the middle prayer. Sahih Muslim Hadith 1877, narrated by Jabir ibn Abdullah. The Apostle of Allah was delivering the sermon on Friday in a standing posture when a caravan from Syria arrived. The people flocked towards it till no one was left with the Prophet but 12 persons. And it was on this occasion that this verse in regard to Jum'ah was revealed. And when they see merchandise or sport, they break away to it and leave thee standing. Sahih Muslim Hadith 4328, narrated by Sa'ad ibn Abu al-Waqqas. Mus'ab ibn Sa'ad said, my father took a sword from the Khums and brought it to the Prophet and said, grant it to me. He refused. At this Allah revealed the Quranic verse. They asked thee concerning the spoils of war. Say, the spoils of war are for Allah and the Apostle. Chapter 8, verse 1. Almost all of such revelations occurred after an event had transpired, or because Muhammad needed a divine justification and sanction for any and all of his requirements, carnal or otherwise. Allah, it seems from these reports, was ready and waiting at all times to be at Muhammad's beck and call to fulfill any and all of his requests instantly and without any prevarications. Of all the prophets so far recorded, Allah, the God of the pagan Arabs, was most and singularly mindful only of Muhammad's personal needs and requirements. One does not have to be a scholar or a rocket scientist to realize that there is something unusual and unsavory about the fact that Muhammad claimed that all his revelations were divinely inspired when in fact, based upon all the above stories alone, not one of them could have been. Each one of these stories and hundreds more in both the Quran and other hadiths prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they were made to order revelations by Muhammad as and when he needed them. The whole of the Quran is nothing more than Muhammad's own alter ego projected into the unsuspecting mouth of Allah, the supreme pagan rock god of the Quraysh tribe, embedded into the corner wall of the Kaaba called the Black Stone. Muhammad, Gabriel, Allah and Satan are one and the same character, Muhammad himself. The most shocking and disturbing realization from all of the above is the certainty that even among the most learned followers of Muhammad, it is impossible for any of them to admit this fact, because it would destroy and completely discredit Muhammad, his Quran, and the whole of Muhammadan Islam.
We incessantly hear and read in the Arabic and Mohammedan Muslim media about Muhammad's unique characters of mercy and compassion. How true are these attributes?
I would like our listeners to share with us the knowledge that is only by divine justice that the Muhammadan records as written by their exegetes and historians uncover the facts, reality and truth about Muhammad's actual attributes. We shall show, based entirely upon these, his own followers' records in the hadiths and his biography, that Muhammad was the exact opposite of what his later and present followers want the world to believe, by the use of the most abysmal levels of misinformation, disinformation, deception, and utter and complete lies. The following examples, taken from different sources, are only the tip of an enormous garbage dump of depraved and obscene acts. Ibn Ishaq 288. The Quraysh said, Muhammad and his companions have violated the sacred month, shed blood, seized property, and taken men captive. It was always Muhammad who broke every Arabian rule and tradition to start with, and then revealed the appropriate made-to-order verses sanctifying his nefarious deeds. Ishaq 535. The women began to cry after learning about Ja'far's death. Disturbed, Muhammad told Abdul Rahman to silence them. When they wouldn't stop wailing, Allah's apostle said, go and tell them to be quiet, and if they refuse, throw dust in their mouths. Ishaq 596. Prophet, this group of Ansar have a grudge against you for what you did with the plunder and how you divided it among your own people. After due praise and exaltation of Allah, he addressed them, Ansar, what is this talk I hear from you? What is the grudge you harbor in your hearts against me? Do you think ill of me? Did I not come to you when you were erring and needy, and then made you rich by Allah? They answered, you came to us discredited when your message was rejected by the Quraysh, and we believed you. You were forsaken and deserted, and we assisted you. You were a fugitive, and we took you in, sheltering you. You were poor and in need, and we comforted you. His followers among the Ansar gave him the most truthful replies in the whole of the hadiths. Tabari 8.97. When I returned to Medina, the Prophet met me in the market and said, give me the woman. I said, Holy Prophet of Allah, I like her, and I have not uncovered her garment. Muhammad said nothing to me until the next day. He again met me in the market and said, Salama, give me the woman. I said, Prophet, I have not uncovered her garment, but she is yours. Tabari 9.34. Khuwaisira came and stood by the Prophet as he was giving gifts to the people and said, Muhammad, I have seen what you have done today. Well, what did you see? He said, I don't think you have been fair. Allah's messenger became angry. Woe to you! If justice is not to be found with me, then with whom is it to be found? Umar ibn al-Khattab said, Muhammad, allow me to kill him. The apostle said, get him away from me and cut off his tongue. Tabari 7.65. When the apostle was in Safra, Nadir was assassinated. When Muhammad reached Irq Zabiya, he killed Uqba. When the Prophet ordered him to be killed, Uqba said, who will look after my children, Muhammad? Hellfire, the apostle replied, and he was murdered. Muhammad, as portrayed in both the Quran and the Ahadith, shows his usual mercy and compassion by slaughtering prisoners of war just because they had satirized him. Tabari 8.38. The Messenger of Allah commanded that all of the Jewish men and boys who had reached puberty should be beheaded. Then the Prophet divided the wealth, wives and children of the Bani Qurayza, Jews, among the Muslims. The listener should be made aware that the Qurayza tribe was not a military organization but manufacturers in leather and metal, and more not a threat to Muhammad or his followers, except that they had wealth that Muhammad coveted and needed to acquire so that he would bribe even more pagans to his cause. The mass murder of civilians and the sea of blood that Muhammad initiated in Arabia was later on continued by his followers against millions of other nationalities in an ocean of blood on 3 continents by the Arab and Muhammadan Muslim conquerors. Ishaq 550. Muhammad ordered that certain men should be assassinated even if they were found behind the curtains of the Kaaba. Among them was Abdullah bin Sa'd. The reason that Allah's Messenger ordered that he should be slain was because he had become a Muslim and used to write Quranic revelations. Then he apostatized, rejected Islam. Muhammadan Islam welcomes all converts with open arms without informing them that if they changed their mind and wanted to opt out, they would lose their head. Ishaq 676. Asma bint Marwan said to the Aus and Khazraj of the Medina, you obey a stranger who encourages you to murder for booty. You are greedy men. Is there no honor among you? Upon hearing those lines, Muhammad said, will no one rid me of this woman? Umayr, a zealous Muslim, decided to execute the Prophet's wishes. That very night, he crept into the writer's home while she lay sleeping surrounded by her young children. There was one at her breast. Umayr removed the suckling babe and then plunged his sword into the poet. The next morning in the mosque, Muhammad, who was aware of the assassination, said, you have helped Allah and his apostle. Umayr said, she had 5 sons. Should I feel guilty? No, the Prophet answered. Killing her was as meaningless as 2 goats butting heads. If killing her was so meaningless, then she could not possibly have been a threat to Muhammad. He had her murdered simply because she opposed him. Bukhari Hadith 4.256. The Prophet passed by and was asked whether it was permissible to attack infidels at night with the probability of exposing their women and children to danger. The Prophet replied, their women and children are from them. Muhammad was able to instill in his followers the most debased instincts that any human being could possibly carry. Deception, lying, cowardice, treachery, perfidy, compounded with a depraved indifference to morality, mercy, or compassion. In fact, his followers became his psychological and intellectual clones, up to this day, as witnessed by their deeds all around the world. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 9.37, narrated by Abu Qilaba. Anas bin Malik said, 8 persons from tribe of Uql came to Allah's apostle and gave the pledge of allegiance for Islam, became Muslims. The climate of the Medina did not suit them, so they became sick and complained about that to Allah's apostle. He said to them, won't you go out with the shepherd of our camels and drink of the camel's milk and urine as medicine? They said yes. So they went out and drank the camel's milk and urine. And after they became healthy, they killed the shepherd of Allah's apostle and took away all the camels. This news reached Allah's apostle, so he sent men to follow them, and they were captured and brought to the Prophet. He then ordered to cut their hands and feet, and their eyes were branded with heated pieces of iron, and then he threw them in the sun till they died. In conclusion, no prophet in recorded human history had ever acted with such depraved pathological indifference towards other human beings. Muhammad is the only allegedly divinely inspired messenger who acted with such manner.
According to my studies of Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasulallah, the biography of Muhammad, I was struck by the fact that his first wife, Khadija, had an enormous and lasting influence on both his theological learning and his psychology. Because she was a woman, the followers of Muhammad have purposefully neglected to highlight her outstanding contributions to Muhammad's self-perceived mission of creating the Quran as a scripture for his fellow pagan Arabs. Will you elaborate on this?
Your conclusion is perfectly correct. In fact, and without the slightest exaggeration, neither Muhammad nor his Quran would have become part of history without Khadija's singular contributions. Let us, as usual, look at the Muhammadan records themselves. It was Ibn Ishaq's Sirat that gave us the very earliest report, as well as a great number of myths about Muhammad and Khadija on pages 82-83. Khadija bint Khuwaylid was a twice widowed, very rich and powerful merchant woman in her 40s when Muhammad was about 25 years of age. According to the so-called traditions, Muhammad was a decent, loyal, honest and intelligent man. Because of his reputation, Khadija employed him to take her goods to Syria and trade with them, in spite of the fact that the traditions also assert that he was illiterate. After he returned with the merchandise, she was able to sell them at a great profit. It was Khadija, contrary to the male-dominated traditions of the Arabs, who proposed marriage to Muhammad, and he accepted. As usual in Muhammadan Islam, controversy surrounds Khadija's children by her second husband and involves the other daughters or stepdaughters of Muhammad. These daughters were Zainab, Ruqayya and Kulthum. Some historians say that these were Khadija's daughters by her second husband, whereas others insist they were her daughters by Muhammad. This is not very probable, considering Khadija's advanced age at the time she married Muhammad. Fatima was the daughter of Muhammad and Khadija. She was Muhammad's favorite daughter. Two boys who died at an early age were Al-Qasim and Al-Tahir. According to the traditions also, depending on which one of course, Khadija was a Hanifiyya, that is, one who was neither a Christian nor of the belief of the Jews, but one who believed only in the God of Abraham. Her uncle was Waraqa bin Nawfal, who had converted from paganism to Christianity. It is extremely important that the listener should be made aware that the Christians and the so-called Jews of Arabia were not foreigners, but actually aboriginal and indigenous natives of Arabia who had willingly, without coercion, converted to these beliefs centuries before Muhammad and his Quran, but were subsequently destroyed and or exiled by Muhammad and his followers. One of the most revealing hadiths regarding Khadija's importance is part of the following, when Muhammad allegedly encountered the angel Gabriel for the first time. Sahih al-Bukhari hadith 1.3, narrated by Aisha. Thereupon he caught me for the third time and pressed me, and then released me and said, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق خلق الإنسان من علق. That is, read in the name of your Lord who has created man from a clot. Then Allah's apostle returned with the inspiration and with his heart beating severely. Then he went to Khadija bint Khuwaylid and said, cover me, cover me. They covered him till his fear was over, and after that he told her everything that had happened and said, I fear that something may happen to me. Khadija replied, never, by Allah, Allah will never disgrace you. Khadija then accompanied him to her cousin Waraqa bin Nawfal, who during the pre-Islamic period became a Christian and used to write the writing with Hebrew letters. He would write from the Gospels in Hebrew as much as Allah wished him to write. He was an old man and had lost his sight. Khadija said to Waraqa, listen to the story of your nephew, O my cousin. Waraqa asked, O my nephew, what have you seen? Allah's apostle described whatever he had seen. Waraqa said, this is the same one who keeps the secrets, the angel Gabriel whom Allah had sent to Moses. Our listeners should know that the angel Gabriel never appeared to Moses, but to Mary, the mother of Jesus. And if Waraka was truly a learned Christian, he would not have uttered such incredible drivel. Al-Tirmidhi Hadith 117, narrated by Ali ibn Abu Talib. Khadija asked Allah Apostle about her children who had died in the days of ignorance. Thereupon Allah's Messenger said, "They are in hellfire." And when he saw the sign of disgust on her face, he said, "If you were to see them in their station, you would hate them." She said, "Allah Messenger, what about my child that was born of your loins?" He said, "It is in paradise." Then Allah Messenger said, "Verily, the believers and their children will be in paradise, and the unbelievers and their children in the hellfire." Muhammad, Allah's Messenger, showed his usual legendary compassion and mercy by consigning innocent children to hell's fires just because their parents were unbelievers. Al-Tirmidhi Hadith 6181, narrated by Anas bin Malik. The Prophet said, "Among the women of the universe, Mary, daughter of Imran, Khadija, daughter of Khuwaylid, Fatima, daughter of Muhammad, and Asiya, the wife of Pharaoh, are enough for you." Our listeners should be aware that Mary, the mother of Jesus, was not the daughter of Imran, nor was Asiya the wife of Pharaoh. Neither the Hebrew Bible nor the New Testament mention these falsehoods. The above are the usual concocted stories that were created during the 300 years after Muhammad's death. Not a single story is based on facts or any kind of records that existed among the Arabs. Just pure lies and mendacities. The following view of Khadija can be found in the Shia book Fatima the Gracious. Khadija's financial support had a great role in strengthening Islam during its prime days, when it was still in the formation stage and critically needed material aid. Allah foreordained Khadija's property to help Islam fulfill its goals. Almost all of the stories regarding Muhammad's wives are the product of centuries of later concoctions to create for Muhammad a family identical in its holiness and purity to that of Jesus and Mary. The most important conclusions regarding Khadija's background show that contrary to the perverted picture painted about the Jahiliyyah Arabs before Muhammad's Islam regarding their women are the following facts. Khadija was able to inherit her father's wealth without the interference of any males of her family. That she was able to act as a merchant without any male's permission. That she was a very successful merchant in her own right, independent of any male. It was she who proposed to Muhammad instead of the traditional other way around. It was she who supported Muhammad throughout his life with her, contrary to the prevailing traditions. She was a very independent and assertive woman. She calmed him when he was disturbed. She encouraged him when he was afraid. She comforted him when he was unsure. She knew about the one and only Allah long before Muhammad's alleged revelations. As a Hanifiya, she was already a believer in the one and only God of Abraham. She exerted enormous influence upon him away from his original paganism. Her Christian relative, Waraka, exposed Muhammad to both the Torah and the Gospels. Contrary to what the traditions assert, he did not marry any other while she was alive, not because he loved her so much, but because she was financially much more powerful than he was. In the end, Muhammad, as was his wont, paid the women of Arabia back with his usual ingratitude by reducing them to the level of sex slaves and domestic animals. Without Khadija's moral, psychological and financial support, Muhammad would not have been able to compose his Quran or succeed in fooling hundreds of millions of people into believing that he was the messenger of Allah. In fact, the female followers of Muhammad should revolt against all the oppressive, terrorizing and humiliating man-made rules and regulations, especially those who live in the Western democracies, and throw away the shackles of enslavement that have been put around them.
According to several versions of the hadiths regarding the night journey, Muhammad was instructed by Allah to pray, as well as his followers, the staggering number of 50 prayers a day. These were reduced to a more manageable 5 prayers a day, with the help of Moses. Will you elaborate?
Let us start with a shortened version of the story first, and then the explanations. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 1.345, narrated by Abu Dahr. Allah's Apostle said, "While I was at Mecca, the roof of my house was opened, and Gabriel descended. opened my chest and washed it with Zamzam water. Then he brought a golden tray full of wisdom and faith, and having poured its contents into my chest, he closed it. Then he took my hand and ascended with me to the nearest heaven. When I reached the nearest heaven, I saw a man sitting with some people on his right and some on his left. I asked Gabriel, "Who is he?" He replied, "He is Adam, and the people on his right and left are the souls of his offspring." Then he ascended with me till we reached the second heaven. Abu Dahr added that this prophet met Adam, Idris, Moses, Jesus, and Abraham. He, Abu Dahr, did not mention on which heaven they were, but he mentioned that the prophet met Adam on the nearest heaven and Abraham on the sixth heaven. The prophet added, "Then Gabriel ascended with me to a place where I heard the creaking of the pens." Ibn Hazm and Anas bin Malik said, "The prophet said, then Allah enjoined 50 prayers on my followers. When I returned with this order of Allah, I passed by Moses, who asked me, 'What has Allah enjoined on your followers?' I replied, 'He has enjoined 50 prayers on them.' Moses said, 'Go back to your Lord and appeal for reduction, for your followers will not be able to bear it.' So I went back to Allah and requested for reduction, and he reduced it to half. When I passed by Moses again and informed him about it, he said, 'Go back to your Lord, as your followers will not be able to bear it.' So I returned to Allah and requested for further reduction, and half of it was reduced. I again passed by Moses, and he said to me, 'Return to your Lord, for your followers will not be able to bear it.' So I returned to Allah, and he said, 'These are 5 prayers, and they are all equal to 50, for my word does not change.' I returned to Moses, and he told me to go back once again. I replied, 'Now I feel shy of asking my Lord again.'" The story of Muhammad's ascent through the 7 heavens is a variation upon the one Muhammad copied and altered to suit himself from the Midrash of the Jews regarding a similar but prior experience made by Moses. The listener should be made aware that there is no mention in this version of the traditions of Muhammad riding Buraq, nor any intermediary visit to the Temple of Solomon at Jerusalem to get from Mecca to the 7 heavens. If Allah really loved Muhammad as much as he claims in the ahadith, then the compassionate and merciful Allah could not and would not have ordered him and his followers to pray 50 times a day. This would have meant that they would neither have time to work, trade, make a living, or sleep, since they would have had to pray every 28.8 minutes of the day and night. Muhammad, slavishly and bereft of any thought or logic, accepted this utterly untenable and unmerciful instruction without any prevarication or objection. Even as an allegorical story, it beggars belief in its stupidity and blasphemy, for insulting Allah's wisdom, compassion, mercy, and fairness, if Allah is the God of Israel and Jesus. It was because Moses repeatedly insisted that Muhammad should ask Allah for a reduction of such an onerous and unreasonable demand that was ultimately reduced from 50 to 5 prayers a day that Muhammad could even have a religion. Both Muhammad and his followers owe Moses an incredible debt of gratitude. Again and again, it can be shown that without a shadow of a doubt, the whole of the cult belief system of Muhammad is built upon the Islamite precepts and foundations of the Bible, as well as upon almost all the traditions and fetishes of the pagan Arabs. In a different version of the same story, Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 4.429, narrated by Malik bin Sasa, the Prophet said, "While I was at the house in a state midway between sleep and wakefulness, an angel recognized me as the man lying between 2 men. A golden tray full of wisdom and belief was brought to me, and my body was cut open from the throat to the lower part of the abdomen, and then my abdomen was washed with Zamzam water, and my heart was filled with wisdom and belief. Al-Buraq, a white animal smaller than a mule and bigger than a donkey, was brought to me, and I set out with Gabriel. When I reached the nearest heaven." In this version, Al-Buraq was used to transport Muhammad from Mecca to the first heaven without any landing at Jerusalem. It should be pointed out that in all the different sources, including Bukhari Hadith 5.227 and 9.608 of the above story, the following extremely important observations should be taken into account. 1. In none of them did Muhammad go to Jerusalem, but went directly from Mecca to the heavens. 2. In none of them did he pray at Jerusalem. 3. There are important discrepancies between the various versions regarding the place where he was asleep, the number of angels who were present and whom he met in the different heavens. 4. In none of them was Buraq tied to or at any sacred rock or wall at Jerusalem. 5. In all of them, it was the advice of Moses which saved Muhammad and Islam from complete and utter irrelevance. 6. In numerous hadiths, Muhammad claims he was the most beloved of Allah's apostles. Based upon the hadiths, it was not through an act of love that Allah demanded 50 prayers from Muhammad and his followers. 7. All of them attest that Muhammad's vital organs were washed and that he was filled with belief. Why was he filled with belief if he was as sinless as his followers insist in their dogma of Isma'? Where among all the above discrepancies is the truth?
Every follower of Muhammad believes sincerely that the Quran that we have today is exactly the same as the one left for them by Muhammad 1400 years ago. How true is their perception?
There is absolutely no doubting the sincerity of their belief. This is, after all, exactly what their scholars have taught them throughout their life, and without actually researching the subject with an open mind, they shall continue to believe it. But let us investigate the records left to us by the scholars of Muhammad and Islam themselves. At the very beginning of Islam, the Quran was being memorized and not yet compiled into a written form, especially since as long as Muhammad was alive and receiving revelations, over a very long period of 23 years, new surahs were being added, while others were being revised, deleted, and or abrogated. Surah Al-Ankabut 29.45. Recite what is sent of the book by inspiration to thee, and establish regular prayer. Surah Al-Fatir 35.31. That which we have revealed to thee of the book is the truth, confirming that which was revealed before it. All verses in the Quran that speak of it as a book are wrong and deceiving, since the Quran was never in book form while Muhammad was alive. When Muhammad died, there existed no singular codex of the Quranic text. That is, there was not in existence any collection of revelations in a final review form. Also, there was not a single memorizer who knew all the verses of the Quran. All these verses were scattered in the memories of hundreds of Huffaz, memorizers. Without a doubt, Muhammad failed utterly in his primary mission of giving his followers a single authorized scripture, because in reality he died without authenticating a unified codex of the Quran. The fact that he left his followers with 7 modes or versions of the Quran speaks volumes about his failure. The consequences of this failure became paramount when his followers were reciting different versions of the alleged words of Allah. This failure has endured and continues for the last 1400 years. All attempts by his present followers to gloss over this fact are doomed to fail, since the records of the Muhammadan scholars in the centuries after his death attest to otherwise. After his death, and as the memorizers, Huffaz, were becoming extinct through slaughter in battle or otherwise, Umar ibn al-Khattab recommended that it should be committed to writing. Abu Bakr entrusted this task to Zayd ibn Thabit of Al-Madinah, who used to be Muhammad's secretary. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 6.509, narrated by Zayd bin Thabit. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq sent for me when the people of the Yamama had been killed, i.e. a number of the Prophet's companions who fought against Musaylimah. I went to him and found Umar ibn al-Khattab sitting with him. Abu Bakr then said to me, Umar has come to me and said, casualties were so heavy among the Qurra of the Quran, i.e. those who knew the Quran by heart, on the day of the Battle of Yamama. And I'm afraid that more heavy casualties may take place among the Qurra on other battlefields, whereby a large part of the Quran may be lost. Therefore I suggest you, Abu Bakr, order that the Quran be collected. So I started looking for the Quran and collected it from what was written on palm stalks, thin white stones, and also from the men who knew it by heart, till I found the last verse of Surah At-Tawbah, repentance, with Abi Khuzaymah al-Ansari, and I did not find it with anybody other than him. All were brought together and the text was constructed. From the above quotes, it means that the pagan Arabs had not by then mastered the art of writing or the use of writing materials, such as clay, papyrus, metal sheets, or even skins of animals. The Arabs of the Hijaz, contrary to all the efforts of Muhammadan propaganda, were mostly illiterate and uneducated people. Then the complete manuscripts of the Quran remained with Abu Bakr till he died, then with Umar till the end of his life, and then with Hafsa, the daughter of Umar. In 651 AD, Uthman bin Affan canonized the Medina Codex and ordered all others, 6 other versions of the Quran, destroyed. If it were true that there were many memorizers of the Quran, why then did they need to collect the Quranic verses from the diverse and unrelated documents such as leafstock, bone, parchments, as well as the memories of men? What is also blatantly problematic to the Muhammadan scholars are the variations in the several extant Qur'ans of the time, making it impossible to tell which version is the alleged word of Allah, since His word should have been only one and not several. In fact, there were several metropolitan codices in Arabia, Syria, and Iraq with divergent readings, blamed on the defective nature of the Kufic script, which contained no vowels. And so the consonants of verbs could be read as actives or passives, and worse still, many of the consonants themselves could not be distinguished without diacritical dots, which were added much later. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 6.510, narrated by Anas bin Malik, addresses this subject perfectly. A further serious impediment which complicated the correct compilation of the Quran is the fact that there were verses which were spoken in Medina, but were included in surahs which began in Mecca and vice versa. The problem that existed and persisted during the lifetime of Muhammad for his followers is the fact that for as long as he was alive, new revelations whereby the omniscient Allah was nonetheless allegedly changing his mind were very conveniently being added to and some subtracted from earlier ones, abrogated and abrogating verses which affected 71 of the 114 surahs of the Quran. This is why at the time of Muhammad's death, there existed no singular codex of the sacred text. It is also reported that some major parts of a surah were eaten by a domestic animal. Another surah, that of Ar-Rajm, was asserted by Umar ibn al-Khattab to have existed, but is not included in the Quran. The final text of the Quran was actually fixed in the year 933 AD. Since the Quran is supposed to be the word of Allah, who is the one who taught Moses the Torah, then the only and unmistakable conclusion for the erroneous inconsistencies and differences between them must be because it was the Muhammadans who corrupted the Quran to suit their own agenda. The criminal invariably projects upon his victim his own hatreds, shortcomings, and lack of morality and justice. So do the Arabs and the Muhammadan scholars. They have conspired over the centuries, and even at the present, to control all the information that they passed on to the believers by perpetuating the myth of the perfect and divine Quran, contrary to the historical, philological, and theological records that prove it to be otherwise. In fact, the greatest threat to Muhammadan Islam is the acquisition of knowledge, especially of the Bible, by the masses of believers. Of 114 surahs in the Quran, only 43 were not changed. All the others had verses that were either abrogated or abrogating. This means that in the course of 23 years of Muhammad's mission, the omniscient Allah changed his mind at least 71 times. In summation, the following historical and theological facts are crystal clear and indisputable. 1. The greatest number of traditions and fetishes of the Muslims are nothing but a continuance and repackaging and Islamization of pagan rites and actions that pre-existed Muhammad and his Quran. 2. Almost all the precepts and concepts of importance in the Quran have been plagiarized, plundered, pirated, and or perverted from the Hebrew Bible as scriptures, from the New Testament and Apocrypha, from pagan Arabian religion, and also from Zoroastrian religion and traditions. Abu al-Fath Muhammad Shahristani, in his valuable book on sex and religions, Al-Milal wal-Nihal, asserts that many of the rights and duties of Islam are continuations and practices which the pagan Arabs had adopted from the Jews. 3. Even if Muhammad were illiterate, not able to read or write, does not negate his ability to compose and recite prose and or poetry. Most of the poets of Arabia were illiterate but masters of the spoken language. The oral poetic tradition of the Arabs was their greatest legacy, since they left almost nothing in the form of writing, thus proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that poetry and prose in Arabia was completely independent from literacy. The followers of Muhammad can try their best to obfuscate, contort, pervert and twist the facts to prove otherwise, but it is a mission impossible to accomplish. That is why, when they cannot counter the truth with facts or logic, they invariably resort to violence to silence their opponents, just as was done earlier by Muhammad.
For centuries and even today, the scholars of Mohammedan Islam assert that both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are not the originals revealed to Moses and Jesus, but are the product of alterations and perversions by their later followers. On what basis can they prove their allegations?
It was Ibn Khazm in 1064 who was the first Mohammedan to charge that the Bible has been corrupted and falsified by the followers of Moses and Jesus. This charge was made in a last-ditch and desperate effort to defend Islam against Christianity, because he came upon the many serious and unexplainable contradictions and differences between the Quran and the Bible. Believing by faith that the Quran is true and incorruptible, Ibn Khazm had absolutely no choice but to come to the conclusion that then it must be the current Bible that is false and untrue, especially since Muhammad instructed his followers to respect the Bible in the first place. Therefore, the present text must have been falsified by the Christians and the Jews after the time of Muhammad. His conclusions and arguments are not based on any original historical facts, but entirely upon his unshakable faith in the truthfulness and divine origin of the Quran. Many other exegetes did not accept or agree with his conclusions, among whom are many of the luminaries of Islam, such as Ali al-Tabari, al-Bukhari, al-Mas'udi, Abu Ali Hussein bin Sina, al-Ghazali, and Ibn Khaldun. In reality, it is not up to the people of the book to prove their book is uncorrupted, but up to the Muhammadans to do so based on any original book that would show these corruptions. The interpreters of the Quran repeatedly denigrate and accuse both the Jews and Christians of having tampered with and corrupted their holy book to suit their, with as yet unexplained and unidentified, nefarious purposes. These evil, mendacious, and unsubstantiated accusations are in fact introduced to cover up the incredibly huge number of unexplainable and irreconcilable differences in both the Quran and its interpretations with the same events as described in their original versions in the Bible and Scriptures. Hence, with an extremely simple and general sentence, they, the followers of Muhammad, attempt to dismiss and gloss over all these discrepancies as items that have been modified deliberately and presumably with diabolical premeditation by the Jews and Christians to deprive Muhammad and his followers of their rightful place among the divinely revealed scriptures. Unfortunately for the Muhammadan accusers, it can be easily demonstrated that in all its relevant verses, the Quran declares the Bible to be a true revelation of Allah and demands faith in it, such as can be shown in the following surahs, which presuppose the availability of the true revelation of Allah to the Arabs at the time of Muhammad. Surah Al-Baqarah 2.136. Say ye, we believe in Allah and the revelation given to us and to Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes, and that given to Moses and Jesus. Al-Baqarah 2.285. The apostle believeth in what has been revealed to him from his Lord, as do the men of faith. Each one of them believeth in Allah, his angels, his books, and his apostles. We make no distinction, they say, between one and another of his apostles. In the above verses, the Quran makes no distinction between Allah's revelation. That is, they are all true and uncorrupted. Surah Ali Imran 3.3. It is He who sent down to thee step by step in truth the book, confirming what went before it. And He sent down law of Moses and the gospel of Jesus before this as a guide to mankind. And He sent down the criterion of judgment between right and wrong. Nowhere does the Quran even imply that the people of the book had corrupted the texts of their scriptures, but only that some of them misrepresented the meaning of some texts. 3.93. All food was lawful to the children of Israel except what Israel made unlawful for itself before the law of Moses was revealed. In the particular case above, the Quran implies that the children of Israel corrupted some of Allah's commands before the revelations to Moses and not after. Surah An-Nisa 4.47. O ye people of the book, believe in what we have now revealed, confirming what was already with you. If, as Al-Khazim and other followers of Muhammad insist that the people of the book have corrupted the books, they could have done this only after Muhammad's Quran and not before, since this verse clearly shows that the Quran is confirming these same previous revelations and would not have done so if they had already been corrupted. Surah Al-Ma'idah 5.44. It was we who revealed the law to Moses. Therein was guidance and light. By its standard have been judged the Jews, by the Prophet who bowed as in Islam to Allah's will, by the rabbis and the doctors of law, for to them was entrusted the protection of Allah's book, and they were witnesses thereto. In the verse above, the Quran asserts that the Jews were entrusted with protecting and preserving Allah's book, the Torah. And there is no indication given here that they failed that trust, especially since it was because they had done so that Muhammad was able to bring about the Quran as a scripture to his own pagan people. Since the followers of Muhammad are certain that the people of the book had deliberately corrupted their books, then the onus is on them to show the original uncorrupted ones, upon which they base their puerile and unsubstantiated allegations. Al-An'am 6.91. Say, who then sent down the book which Moses brought, a light and a guidance to mankind? Al-An'am 6.92. And this is a book which we have revealed, bringing blessings and confirming the revelations which came before it. It would defy logic and intellect to believe that the Quran would have used corrupted books as confirmation of its own authenticity. Nowhere does the Quran ever imply that the text of the scriptures of the people of the book had been tampered with or corrupted. Since this is the case, then any alleged corruptions would have had to have happened after the Quranic revelations. If so, then the Muhammadan accusers have an unenviable intellectual, theological, and historical magical act to perform. 1. They have to prove the most stupendous and massive literary editing ever performed in the history of humanity. That the Jews and Christians were able to alter the text of every single book of theirs all over the world, in every country, in all the languages that the Bible was written in, with the consent, agreement, and collusion of all the Jewish rabbis as with all the Christian priests, without leaving a single copy of any original Bible. 2. To believe that the Jews and Christians were able to accomplish all the above without leaving a trace of such a conspiracy requires a human mind and intellect that also believes in flying elephants and that the moon is made of cheese. 3. The listener should be aware that every commentary in every Quran attempting to explain the Quranic verses is based upon the very same allegedly corrupted Bibles. 4. The onus is upon the followers of Muhammad to prove their case by showing mankind a single, original, uncorrupted Bible upon which they can rest their fallacious, insane, contemptible, and ignoramus allegations. 4. It is the simple case of put up or shut up.
I was astounded to learn that the Sunni Mohammedan scholars of Arabia teach their children in this 21st century that the earth is flat and that the moon landing is a great deception by the unbelievers. Is this true?
In the Quran, the word ilm knowledge has only one meaning: knowledge of religion and not of anything else. It is a deliberate lie when Muhammad has pointed out the word knowledge as pertaining to the sciences, arts, and independent thought. Muhammadan scholars have written an enormous number of books claiming that Muhammad was a super genius whose knowledge was stupendous and way ahead of its time. The following are a very small sample of verses and ahadith that show the true state of affairs, and it is left to the listener to evaluate the veracity or lack thereof of such claims. Surah Al-Hijr 15.19. And the earth we have spread out like a carpet, set thereon mountains firm and immovable. Al-Nahl 16.15. And he has set up on the earth mountains standing firm, lest it should shake with you. Al-Kahf 18.47. One day we shall remove the mountains, and thou shalt see the earth as a level stretch. That means that the earth is flat and the mountains are what hold it in stretch. 18.86. Until when he reached the setting of the sun, he found it set in a spring of murky water. Near it he found a people. We said, O Zulqarnain, thou hast authority either to punish them or to treat them with kindness. The sun, which is at least 1,000,000 times bigger than the earth, sets in a puddle of muddied water. Al-Anbiya 21.30. Do not the unbelievers see that the heavens and the earth were joined together before we clove them asunder? We made from water every living thing. Neither in the Bible nor in biology is there such an absurd and unrealistic idea. Life, according to the theory of evolution, started in water and not from water. Surah Yasin 36.40. It is not permitted to the sun to catch up the moon, nor can the night outstrip the day. Al-Saffat 37.6. We have indeed decked the lower heavens with beauty in the stars. According to astronomy, there is no heaven, and the stars are definitely not for decorative purposes. Fussilat 41.12. So he completed them as 7 firmaments in 2 days, and he assigned to each heaven its duty and command. And we adorned the lower heaven with lights and provided it with guard. Neither the Bible, which is the source of this version of creation, nor astronomy mention any 7 heavens. Al-Abasa 80.17. From what stuff did he create man? From nutfa, male and female semen drops. He created him and set him in due proportion. Neither Muhammad nor the translators of this verse got it right, since the woman provides the ovum and not the semen drops. Sunan Abu Dawud Hadith 4705, narrated by Al-Abbas bin Abdul Muttalib. I was sitting in Ba'tha with a company among whom the Apostle of Allah was sitting. He asked, do you know the distance between heaven and earth? They replied, we do not know. He then said, the distance between them is 71, 72, or 73 years. The heaven which is above, it is a similar distance. Above the 7th heaven, there is a sea, the distance between whose surface and bottom is like that between one heaven and the next. Above that, there are 8 mountain goats, the distance between whose hoofs and haunches is like the distance between one heaven and the next. Then Allah, the Blessed and the Exalted, is above that. Muhammad, being a cameleer, measured distances by time. That is, the time it takes him and his animal to get from point A to point B. He of course applies the same methodology to describe astronomical distances without qualifying the rate of speed. Moreover, according to all the knowledge that we have regarding astronomy and cosmology, Muhammad's concepts are, to put it mildly, ignorant, stupid, and infantile. Sunan Abu Dawud Hadith 5222, narrated by Buraidah ibn al-Hasib. I heard the Apostle of Allah say, a human being has 360 joints, for each of which he must give alms. Bukhari Hadith 1.510. Allah Apostle said, if it is very hot, the severity of the heat is from the raging of the hellfire. According to human anatomy, Muhammad is once again wrong. His obsession with hell is unrelenting and satanic, as revealed in so many verses of the Quran and Hadith. Bukhari Hadith 4.482. Allah apostle said, the hellfire complained to its Lord, saying, "O my Lord, my different parts are eating each other up." So he allowed it to take two breaths, one in winter, the other in summer. This is the reason for the severe heat and bitter cold you find in weather. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 4.430, narrated by Abdullah bin Mas'ud. Allah Apostle, the true and truly inspired, said, the matter of the creation of a human being is put together in the womb of the mother in 40 days. And then he becomes a clot of thick blood for a similar period. And then a piece of flesh for a similar period. This is a gestation period of 3 months, which is of course contrary to biology. So much for Muhammad's knowledge and divine inspirations. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 4.494, narrated by Ibn Umar. Allah Apostle said, you should not seek to pray at sunrise or sunset, for the sun rises between two sides of the head of the devil or Satan. Excellent Muhammadan science of astronomy. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 4.537, narrated by Abu Huraira. The Prophet said, if a housefly falls in the drink of any one of you, he should dip it in the drink, for one of its wings has a disease and the other has the cure for the disease. Muhammad's superb intellectual and hygienic analysis and conclusions are beyond measure. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 4.539, narrated by Abu Talha. The Prophet said, angels do not enter a house which has either a dog or a picture in it. Bukhari Hadith 4.546. Allah's Apostle said, Gabriel has just now told me of the answer. If a man has sexual intercourse with his wife and gets discharged first, the child will resemble him. And if the woman gets discharged first, the child will resemble her. Even the archangel of Allah is made to look profoundly stupid. Tabari 1.293. When Allah cast Adam down from a paradise, Adam's feet were on earth while his head was in heaven. Adam was not cast down from paradise. He was kicked out from the Garden of Eden, which was on earth and not in heaven. There are hundreds more of similar hadiths and Quranic verses, but I hope that the above are sufficient for the listeners to have learned a great deal of correct and truthful facts and knowledge from the mouth of Muhammad.
Almost every book, newspaper or thesis written by the scholars of Mohammedan Islam rebuke, defame and insult the West, especially for their imperialism and occupation of Arab and Mohammedan lands, but at the same time glorify their own conquests and find nothing hypocritical with such logic. What about their conquests?
You are absolutely right in labeling their behavior as hypocritical. I must point out to our listeners the following irrefutable facts. It was because of Western imperialism that Arab and Mohammedan lands were introduced to education, sanitation, electricity, running water, democracy, roads, trains, cars, planes, medicine, inoculation, etc., etc. It was also because of Western imperialism that the Arabs were liberated from the yoke of the Mohammedan Muslim Ottoman Empire, and 22 Arab countries that did not exist before were created. It was due to Western imperialism that these peoples rediscovered their past history due exclusively to the archaeological discoveries and research financed and conducted entirely by the West. Now let me compare these positive achievements of the West with what the Mohammedan Muslims contributed towards their conquered peoples and lands. Let us first set the record straight. The Arab conquests during and after the death of Muhammad were not only motivated by the desire to spread Islam, but mainly to acquire territory and wealth. In fact, the spread of Islam was just a byproduct of the conquests. As was true throughout human history, enormous wealth brought with it enormous power. Wealth and power are synonymous, but enormous power also engendered enormous corruption. The Arabs were just as greedy and just as weak as anyone else when faced between the choice of acquiring wealth or staying as good, observant, poor Muslims in the Arabian desert. The Arabs conquered and subjugated other peoples and lands and became just another imperialist power. The same modern Arabs and Mohammedans who condemn European and American imperialism have very conveniently forgotten their own conquests. Unlike all other imperial powers that have ceased to exist, Arab imperialism continues to this day, 1400 years later, in control and in subjugation of peoples and lands that never belonged to them except through conquest and enslavement. The speed with which the Arabs were able to conquer was astounding, and the main reason, especially in what we call today Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Israel, and Egypt, was because most of these peoples welcomed them as would-be deliverers from the intolerance and subjugation of the Byzantine Christian Empire. Very few of the Arab victories would have been possible had the populace been hostile to them. It is the fact that the Arabs had absolutely no instruments of siege, nor were they adept at such warfare at the very beginning of their conquests. Muhammad started the Arabs on the path of imperialism from the time of the Hijrah in 622 CE with the following allegedly revealed verses. Al-Tawbah 9.5. But when the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans whenever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. 9.29. Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and His Apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, Islam, even if they are of the people of the book, Jews and Christians, until they pay the jizya, poll tax, with willing submission and feel themselves humiliated. Ali Imran 3.19. The religion before Allah is Islam, submission to His will. 3.85. If anyone desires a religion other than Islam, submission to Allah, never will it be accepted of him. Muhammad started his jihad, plunder and slaughter sanctified by Allah, first against his own tribe of the Quraysh, then followed with the forced conversion or destruction of other tribes, the Arabians, then the Arabian Jews and the Christians. Based upon the above alleged divine revelations, the forcibly converted, illiterate and uncivilized Arab Bedouins, led by the caliphs who succeeded Muhammad, conducted wars of extermination and or subjugation against all of humanity from Iraq and Syria to Iran, from India to China, from Egypt to the Atlantic, and from Cyprus to Italy, Spain, and France. In about 100 years, the Arabs and their forced converts achieved an empire greater in size than that of Rome's of 1,000 years. This Arab empire caused the destruction, plunder of wealth, and enslavement not only of millions of human beings, but also of temples, religions, civilizations, traditions, cultures, art, and languages of the subjugated peoples and nations. The so-called Islamic arts were and are only copies of those of the Byzantine, Sassanid, and Indian civilizations. The so-called Islamic civilization is a first-class misnomer, because in reality it should be called the Mawali civilization, since the Arabs had no civilization to contribute to the enslaved peoples. On the contrary, it was the subjugated civilizations that gave the Arabs the foundations upon which to continue, with fits and starts, and against all the Islamic Sharia laws and Arab traditions, on the path that led them to greater enlightenment. Converse to all the lies and propaganda of the Arabs, past and present. Most of the scientists and luminaries of Islam were actually from among the Mawali, the converted subjugated peoples of Islam, such as the Persians, Syrians, Jews, Christians, Hindus, etc., as the Islamic records themselves assert. Without a shadow of a doubt, Arab imperialism has been the most enduring, the most destructive, and the least useful in the history of the world. This assertion is based entirely on the following indisputable facts. 1. There was no Arab civilization in the area and era of Muhammad. His followers were mostly illiterate and very simple and superstitious nomadic and semi-nomadic people. 2. The Arabs conquered several of the most ancient and established civilizations in the world, plundered them, massacred many, and enslaved and subjugated the remainder. This applies particularly to the Byzantine Empire, which fell more due to Christian infighting than to Arab military prowess. Arab and Islamic imperialism was so total that they forced the conquered peoples to convert to Muhammadan Islam, to lose their religious and cultural identities as well as their language. The Arabs could not and did not contribute anything to them, since they themselves were far inferior culturally, theologically, and intellectually. Arab imperialism, unlike that of the Persians, Greek, Romans, and the recent so-called Western imperialism, is almost totally parasitic. 3. Nearly 95% of all so-called Muslim scientists were from among the Mawalis, converts from among the conquered peoples, and not pure Arabs. All of them excelled not because of Muhammad and Islam, but in spite of it. And invariably, during periods of history, when the conditions were of toleration that allowed Christians, Jews, and others to contribute and cross-fertilize knowledge. It is a given that a human intellect can only thrive under conditions of freedom of thought and the ability to exchange ideas and communication. It can never excel under conditions of theocratic terror, as invariably exists under the Sharia law of Muhammadan Islam. For most of the so-called Islamic science was only built upon the foundations of Greek, Roman, Hebrew, Byzantine, Persian, and Indian knowledge. And had it not been for the translations of these ideas and thoughts by Christians and Jews of the Arabian Empire, Islamic science would not have existed. In fact, nothing of value, intellectual, artistic, spiritual, or literary, can ever sprout in the darkness cast by fundamentalist Muhammadan Islam upon all the peoples and lands that it occupies. Ladies and gentlemen, the most perfect example of the fundamentalist Muhammadan state was that of the Taliban in Afghanistan, a nation of mind-boggling ignorance, of depraved injustice and inhumanity. Human intellect and achievements can only excel in the sunshine of freedoms of thought, religion, politics, literature, art, and expression, which Muhammadan Islam abhors, avoids, and detests.
From my research of the Quran and Hadiths, I found a great number of verses that mention how Allah and Muhammad had a 20% share of all the plunder, booty, loot, and slaves taken by Muhammad and his followers in their piratical raids. I'm embarrassed to ask, why would Allah, if he is the almighty creator of the universe, need any share of the plunder of his own creation? What kind of logic, morality, or intellect would attribute such blasphemy to any divine entity?
In Arabic, the fifth of the plunder is called al-khums, or 20%, which is the portion of all booty, plunder, and loot taken in piratical raids upon innocent and unsuspecting tribes and people. That is the share of Allah and Muhammad. The Quran and Ahadith do not tell us the percentage proportion of the khums that belongs to Allah and what to Muhammad. One must come to the conclusion, after studying the subject, that it really is irrelevant, since Allah never claimed his share, all of which hence belonged to Muhammad. Why would Allah, the alleged creator of the universe, need a share from the booty and plunder of his own creation, as perpetrated by Muhammad and his thugs? Neither Muhammad nor the Ahadith, nor for that matter any of his followers, past, present, or future, can possibly give a logical and reasonable explanation for it. In fact, to attribute to Allah such a need is by itself an act of utter blasphemy. Al-Nisa 4.94. With Allah are profits and spoils abundant. Muhammad's Allah rewards his followers with booty and spoils on earth, and even greater ones in the afterlife, for massacring, murdering, despoiling, subjugating, raping, plundering, and enslaving all those who do not believe in Allah and his messenger Muhammad. Muhammad's compassionate and merciful Allah deliberately predestines these wretched creatures to their undeserved fate. They had no choice or free will in the matter. It is no great wonder that a great number of avaricious, ignorant, and stupid men would follow and believe in such a generous deity. Surah Al-Anfal 8.1. They ask thee concerning things that are taken in spoils of war. Say, such spoils are at the disposal of Allah and the Apostle. Point 4.1. And know that out of all the booty that you may acquire in war, a fifth share is assigned to Allah and to the Apostle. Sahih Muslim Hadith 4328, narrated by Sa'ad bin Abu Waqqas. Musab bin Sa'ad said, my father took a sword from the khums and brought it to the Prophet and said, grant it to me. He refused. At this Allah revealed the Quranic verse. They ask thee concerning the spoils of war. Say, the spoils of war are for Allah and the Apostle. All the spoils of war are for Muhammad only, to dispense with as he wished. He invariably used the booty and plunder to bribe and entice pagan Arabs to join his cult and to buy weapons to fight with. As usual, a very convenient made-to-order verse descends from Allah to justify it by divine order. Sahih Muslim Hadith 4346, narrated by Abu Hurairah. The Messenger of Allah said, if a township disobeys Allah and His Messenger and actually fights against the Muslims, 1/5 of the booty seized therefrom is for Allah and His Apostle, and the rest is for you. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 5.637, narrated by Buraidah. The Prophet sent Ali to bring the khums of the booty, and I hated Ali. And Ali had taken a bath after a sexual act with a slave girl from the khums. When we reached the Prophet, I mentioned that to him. He said, "Oh Buraidah, do you hate Ali?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Do you hate him? For he deserves more than that of the khums." Ali had no right to rape her without first getting permission from Muhammad. Sunan Abu Dawood Hadith 2731, narrated by Abdullah ibn Abbas. The Apostle of Allah said on the day of Badr, "He who does such and such will have such and such." The young men came forward, and the old men remained standing near the banners, and they did not move from there. When Allah bestowed victory on them, the old men said, "We were support for you. If you had been defeated, you would have returned to us. Do not take this booty alone, and we remain deprived of it." The young men refused to give, and said, "The Apostle of Allah has given it to us." Then Allah sent down, "They ask thee concerning things taken as spoils of war. Say, such spoils are at the disposal of Allah and the Apostle." Sunan of Abu Dawood Hadith 2743, narrated by Habib ibn Maslama. The Apostle of Allah used to give a quarter of the booty as a reward after the fifth had been taken off, and a third after the fifth had been kept off when he returned. The so-called rewards that Muhammad was giving were not actually his to start with, not as a product of honest sweat and toil, but as a product of loot and plunder. Sunan Abu Dawood Hadith 2737, narrated by Abdullah ibn Umar. The Apostle of Allah sent a detachment to Najd. I went out along with them and got abundant riches. Our commander gave each of us a camel as a reward. We then came upon the Apostle of Allah, and he divided the spoils of war amongst us. Each of us received 12 camels after taking a fifth of it. The Apostle of Allah did not take account of our companion, that is the commander of the army, nor did he blame him for what he had done. Thus each man of us had received 13 camels with the reward he gave. Muhammadan Islam was, is, and forever will be primarily about booty, plunder, rape, and enslavement.
Based upon my own studies of the subject, the followers of Muhammad have turned him into a sinless human being, in similitude to Jesus. How accurate is their assertion?
It was the later Muhammadan exegetes who created the dogma of Isma', sinlessness of Muhammad, in emulation of the Christian one regarding Jesus. This doctrine of Muhammad's alleged infallibility, impeccability, and sinlessness emerged slowly over the centuries. This doctrine, a total and undeniable perversion of reality and fact, is based only on dogma, and not on any truthful record, since the Quran and Ahadith themselves repeatedly and unequivocally state and show that Muhammad was only a man, a mortal, who suffered their strengths and weaknesses of fallibility and sinfulness. Muhammadan scholars have only themselves to blame for their unsuccessful endeavors at perverting and tampering with the historical and their own theological records by attempting to make Muhammad seem incorruptible and infallible, contrary to the evidence at hand. These distortions of the reports of the Ahadith are contrary to the Quranic verses which repeatedly declared that Muhammad was only a human messenger subject to human frailties and temptations. Ali Imran 3.144. Muhammad is no more than an apostle. Many were the apostles that passed away before him. Al-Kahf 18.110. Say, I am but a man like yourselves, but the inspiration has come to me that your Allah is one Allah. This verse shows clearly that Allah was already known as a God of the pagan Arabs long before Muhammad and his Quran. The only difference is that Muhammad insisted that Allah is one deity without any associates. Al-Anbiya 21.35. Every soul shall have a taste of death, and we test you by evil and by good, by way of trial. To us you return. Al-Ghafir 40.55. Patiently then persevere, for the promise of Allah is true, and ask forgiveness for thy fault, and celebrate the praises of thy Lord in the evening and in the morning. Al-Ahqaf 46.9. Say, I am no bringer of newfangled doctrine among the apostles, nor do I know what will be done with me or with you. I follow but that which is revealed to me by inspiration. I am but a warder, open and clear. Al-Fath 48.1. Verily, we have granted thee a manifest victory, that Allah may forgive thee thy faults of the past and those to follow. Some of the commentators take this to mean sins committed by Muhammad before his call and after it. Others refer to the word to the liaison with the Coptic handmaiden Mary and to his marriage with Zainab, the wife of his adopted son Zayd. None of the commentators that have been researched, including Al-Bayzawi, Al-Jalalain, Al-Kamalan, and Hussein, give the last interpretation. They all say it refers to his sins before and after his call to the apostleship. The hadiths are replete with sayings and stories that show Muhammad being as sinful as any other human being with similar weaknesses and strengths. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 1.46, narrated by Ubadah bin Samit. The Prophet said, I came out to inform you about the date of the night of Al-Qadr. But so and so and so and so quarreled. Its knowledge was taken away. I forgot it. And maybe it was better for you. Now look for it in the 7th, the 9th, and the 5th of the last 10 nights of the month of Ramadan. Muhammad, allegedly the greatest of the prophets, forgot the date of the most momentous instance of his life, the night when the first verse of the Quran was allegedly revealed to him by the angel Gabriel. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 1.394, narrated by Abdullah. The Prophet turned his face to us and said, if there had been anything changed in the prayer, surely I would have informed you. But I am a human being like you, and liable to forget like you. So if I forget, remind me. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 8.388, narrated by Aisha. The prophets used to say, O Allah, I seek refuge with you from the affliction of the fire, the punishment of the fire, the affliction of the grave, the punishment of the grave, and the evil of the affliction of poverty, and cleanse my heart from all sins. Sahih Muslim Hadith 328, narrated by Abu Hurairah. The Messenger of Allah said, I found myself in Hijr and the Quraysh were asking me about my night journey. I was asked about things pertaining to Bayt al-Maqdis, which I could not preserve in my mind. I was very much vexed, so vexed as I had never been before. Then Allah raised it, Bayt al-Maqdis, before my eyes. I looked towards it, and I gave them the information about whatever they questioned me. Yet again, Muhammad, the alleged greatest of all the previous prophets, who had only hours earlier just returned from his night mythical journey, already forgot what the Temple of Solomon looked like, although he had just declared that he had led all the other prophets in prayers there a few hours earlier. Moreover, the listener should be made aware that in the days of Muhammad there was no Temple of Solomon in existence, since it had already been destroyed by the Romans 550 years earlier. Muhammad was blatantly deceiving and lying to his followers. Sunan Abu Dawood Hadith 5036, narrated by Abu al-Azhar al-Anamari. When the Apostle of Allah went to his bed at night, he would say, O Allah, forgive me my sin. Drive away my devil, free me from my responsibility, and place me in the highest assembly. Sunan Abu Dawood Hadith 5043, narrated by Aisha al-Mu'mineen. When the Apostle of Allah awoke at night, he said, There is no God but thou, glory be to thee. O Allah, I ask thy pardon for my sin, and I ask thee for thy mercy. Al-Tabari 6.75, Messenger, how did you first know with absolute certainty that you were a prophet? He replied, 2 angels came to me while I was somewhere in Mecca. One angel said, Open his breast and take out his heart. He opened my chest and heart, removing the pollution of Satan and the clot of blood, and threw them away. And last but not least are the satanic verses that he uttered, as reported by Ibn Ishaq Sirat Rasulullah, as well as by Al-Waqidi and his Ashab al-Nuzul, Ibn Sa'ad in his Kitab al-Tabaqat al-Kabir, Ibn Jarir al-Tabari in his monumental Islamic history of the world, Bukhari Hadith 6.385 and others. Originally, the Quran followed Al-Najm 53:19. Have you seen Lat and Uzza and another, the third goddess Manat? These are the exalted cranes, Gharaniq, intermediaries, whose intercession is to be hoped for. These verses were later abrogated and edited out and replaced with 53.21. What? For you the male sex and for him the female? Behold, such would be indeed a division most unfair. There are hundreds more ahadith that reflect very badly upon Muhammad's character that no one can actually challenge, since they were not written by his enemies, but by the Muhammadan Muslims who had absolutely no reason whatsoever to make him deliberately look bad.
I have recently read Hitler's Mein Kampf and was fascinated and struck by the similarities of thought, concepts, perverted ideas, racism, hate-mongering and warmongering that fill its pages with Muhammad's Quran. Even in the Hadiths, as well as in the Charter of Umar, the discriminatory and racist rules and regulations against Christians, Jews and unbelievers are almost identical to the race laws of the Nazis. Can you elaborate on this?
People who have not read the Quran and Mein Kampf will find it extremely difficult to accept what you have just said. Unfortunately, the facts based upon the two books show remarkable similarities, as I shall proceed to show with all the relevant references. Only miles and years distinguished Hitler from his mentor, Muhammad. Der Führer's methods for accomplishing his madness were identical to their prophets. Mein Kampf 6:7-6. Men must threaten and dominate men by compulsion. Compulsion is only broken by compulsion, and terror by terror. The lever that coerces compulsion is terror. Hitler simply followed Muhammad's path. Bukhari 4.220. Allah's apostle said, I have been made victorious with terror. Mein Kampf 6:7-7. Since our view of life will never share power with another, it cannot cooperate with the existing doctrines it condemns. It is obliged to fight by all available means until the entire world of hostile ideas collapses. Throughout the entirety of the Islamic era, we have heard a singular battle cry. Bukhari 4.386. Our Prophet, the Messenger of our Lord, ordered us to fight you till you worship Allah alone. Both men envisioned an eternal battle and total submission. Mein Kampf 6:7-7. This corrosive fight for the new program and new view of life demands determined fighters and a forceful fighting organization. The recipe for a favorable result requires the formulation of a declaration of war against all existing order and against all existing conceptions of life in general. Just like Islam, it was the Nazis against the world. The house of Islam forever battles Dar al-Harb, the house of war. Tabari 9.69. He who believes in Allah and His Messenger has protected his life and possessions from us. As for those who disbelieve, we will fight them forever in the cause of Allah, fi sabilillah. Killing them is a small matter to us. The Nazis usurped Muhammad's dogma. The recipe of submit and obey was perfect for empowering Hitler, their tyrant. Mein Kampf 6:7-9. The strength of a party lies in the disciplined obedience of the members to follow their leadership. The decisive factors are leadership and discipline. When troops battle one another, the victorious one will be that which is blindly obedient to the superior leader. Ishaq 6:01. The best men launch spears as if they were swords. They devote their lives to their prophet. In hand-to-hand fighting and cavalry attacks, they purify themselves with the blood of the infidels. They consider that an act of piety. it is hard to distinguish which doctrine was more fixated on violence. Mein Kampf 680. In order to lead a view of life to victory, we have to transform it into a fighting movement. Ishaq 587. Our onslaught will not be a weak, faltering affair. We shall fight as long as we live. We shall fight until you turn to Islam, humbly seeking refuge. We will fight not caring whom we meet. We will fight whether we destroy ancient holdings or newly gotten gains. We have cut off every opponent's nose and ears with our swords. We have driven them violently before us at the command of Allah and Islam. We will fight until our religion is established, and we will plunder them, for they must suffer disgrace. Like Muhammad, Hitler seduced men before he coerced them. He made promises but never delivered. The following Islamic concepts made Hitler's list in Mein Kampf: abrogation, annulment of treaties, confiscation of war booty, distribution of spoils, the parties cut off, fifth, al-khums, conquest, expulsion of non-believers, Jewish businesses to be looted and divided, Jewish land to become communal, Jews to be punished by death, the establishment of the laws of Der Führer, the formation of an army, restrictions on journalists, and the recasting of Christianity. Apart from time and place, Der Führer's list was an awful lot like the prophets. Mein Kampf 698. The Nazis must not become a bailiff of public opinion, but its ruler. It must not be the masses' slave, but their master. Muhammad wasn't much of a listener either. Quran 47.21. Were they to obey, showing their obedience in modest speech, after the matter of preparation for jihad had been determined for them, it would have been better. If the definition of propaganda is artful deceit, Hitler and Muhammad were grandmasters. Mein Kampf 701. On behalf of our view of life, I will strike the weapon of reply from the enemy's hand personally. And how might Hitler accomplish this? Mein Kampf 702. Skillful propaganda. The best proof of this was furnished by the success of the propaganda. I had before me a surging crowd, filled with the most sacred indignation and utter wrath. In this meeting, I became familiar with the pathos and the gestures which mesmerizing 1,000 people demands. Islam and Nazism share an unhealthy trait, the willingness to link sacred to wrath. And neither can be trusted, as they are willing to abrogate treaties which they do not like. Quran 9.3. And a declaration from Allah and His Messenger to all mankind. Allah is free from all treaty obligations with non-Muslims, that is, unbelievers, and so is His Messenger. Confirming the role of seductive verbal expression in achieving victory, Der Führer said, Mein Kampf 704, the emphasis was put on the spoken word because only it is in a position to bring about great changes for general psychological reasons. Enormous world revolutionary events have not been brought about by the written word, but by the spoken word. Bukhari 6.662. Allah Apostle said, some eloquent speech is as effective as magic. Bukhari 9.127. The Prophet said, I have been given the keys of eloquent speech and given victory with terror. So the treasures of the earth were given to me. The study of Islam, like Nazism, is an expose on gang mentality, uncorrupted by Islam or left free to choose. Few, if any, Arabs would have been capable of perpetrating such horrific deeds. Yet as part of Muhammad's gang of ghouls, they fed off each other's rage. Mein Kampf 845. Nazism must claim the right to force its principles on the whole and educate everyone about its ideas and thoughts without regard to previous boundaries. This is in order to impose Nazism on the world and then to indoctrinate the victims. Bukhari 4.196. Allah's Apostle said, I have been ordered to fight all the people till they say, none has the right to be worshipped but Allah. Islam and Nazism seduced a sufficient number of men to become popular enough to build a coercive militant force. Both usurped pagan traditions to condition adherents and then establish absolute authority over them. By emancipating his indoctrinated followers from Muhammad's legacy, we free them and ourselves from its scourge. The clues in Mein Kampf that the Nazis were intent on world conquest were not less clear than those found in the Quran. Mein Kampf 9:5-3. The German needs only to be given land by the sword. Bukhari 4.288. Expel disbelievers from the Arabian Peninsula. Quran 2.191. Slay them wherever you find them and catch them, and drive them out from where they have turned you out. When will the world learn to read the words on the page? When will we come to understand that tolerating evil leads to disaster? Islam and Nazism are intolerant dictatorial fighting machines. I can recite you any of 1,000 Quran and Hadith quotes to match these, but instead, I would like our listeners to contemplate the overwhelming similarity of the message, the motivation, and the means Hitler and Muhammad used to attack mankind. Then consider the catastrophic consequences of ignoring or even tolerating Islam's jihadi message.
It is a fact that the majority of the followers of Muhammad, over 1 billion of them, are illiterate in the Arabic language and hence must trust and depend on their mullahs to explain the Quran to them. Based upon your research of the subject, as well as upon your personal contacts with different Mohammedan nationalities, what are your conclusions?
I must emphasize repeatedly that a believer will not be swayed by logic or facts, which would undermine his or her beliefs. They must be able to ignore as well as deny both reality and facts. My experiences even with many of the highly educated Mohammedan Muslims, any and all my proofs are ignored without challenge. Nonetheless, let us share a few examples with our listeners. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 1.777 narrated by Abu Salama. In the morning of the 20th of Ramadan, the Prophet delivered a sermon saying, "Whoever has performed i'tiqaf with me should continue it. I have been shown the night of Al-Qadr, but have forgotten its date. But it is in the odd nights of the last 10 nights." Sahih Muslim Hadith 2631 narrated by Abdullah ibn Unais. Allah Messenger said, "I was shown Laylat al-Qadr, then I was made to forget it." Muhammad, the self-proclaimed greatest of all the other prophets, could not remember the date of the most momentous event in his life, the night of revelation of the first verse of the Quran. Since Muhammad could not even remember the date of a recent and extremely important event and was not able to predict any future event, by what standard of logic could he be called a prophet? Sahih Muslim Hadith 328 narrated by Abu Hurairah. The Messenger of Allah said, "I found myself in Hijr and the Quraysh were asking me about my night journey. I was asked about things pertaining to Bayt al-Maqdis, Temple of Solomon, which I could not preserve in my mind. I forgot. I was very much vexed, so vexed as I had never been before." Once more does Muhammad admit to his fallible memory. Yet again, Muhammad could not remember another momentous event in his life. Muhammad forgot what the Temple of Solomon looked like, the very same that he had only visited a few hours earlier, and led prayers at the head of all the previous Hebrew prophets on his alleged miraculous night journey. The listener should be aware that in the year 622 AD, there was no Temple of Solomon in existence, since it had already been destroyed by the Romans 550 years earlier. Muhammad was actually deliberately and mendaciously deceiving his gullible but believing followers. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 1.394 narrated by Abdullah. The Prophet turned his face to us and said, "If there had been anything changed in the prayer, surely I would have informed you, but I am a human being like you and liable to forget like you. So if I forget, remind me." Sahih Bukhari Hadith 3.244 narrated by Abu Sa'id al-Khudri. The Prophet said, "Whoever was in i'tiqaf with me should stay in i'tiqaf for the last 10 days. For I was informed of the date of the night of Qadr, but I have been caused to forget it." Sahih Bukhari Hadith 6.550 narrated by Abdullah. The Prophet said, "It is a bad thing that some of you say, 'I have forgotten such and such a verse in the Quran.' For indeed, he has been caused by Allah to forget it. So you must keep on reciting the Quran, because it escapes from the hearts of men faster than camels do. Sahih al-Bukhari hadith 6.558, narrated by Aisha. Allah Apostle heard a man reciting the Quran at night and said, "May Allah bestow His mercy on him, as he has reminded me of such and such verses and such surahs which I was caused to forget." Sahih Bukhari hadith 6.559, narrated by Abdullah. The Prophet said, "Why does any one of the people say, I have forgotten such and such a verse in the Quran? He in fact is caused by Allah to forget." It was typical of Muhammad never to admit error or fault, but blame everything on outside agents such as Allah, Gabriel, Satan, Quraysh, Jews, etc. The followers of Muhammad at the present time walk perfectly in his footsteps by always denying any wrongdoing and blaming everything on others.
One of the most ingrained dogmas among the followers of Muhammad is that he was illiterate. That is, he could not read and write. They have created this dogma to prove to the world that Muhammad could not possibly have created the verses of the Quran, and hence they had to have been revealed to him by Allah. Are these assumptions factual?
The Quran and Muhammad's followers use this alleged illiteracy as a fact, and hence imply that the Quranic revelations are divine. This is of course utterly false and nonsensical, since the greatest legacy of the pagan Arabs was their poetry. Their poets were able to recite excellent odes although they were illiterate. Their poetry did not depend on whether or not they could read and or write. According to the historical records, Muhammad actually plagiarized some very important verses from other poets and put them in his Quran. Such poets as Imr al-Qais, Hassan bin Thabit, Zayd bin Nufail, etc. Most relevant of all are the following hadith stories written by his followers and not by his enemies that paint a completely different picture. Sahih al-Bukhari hadith 7.573, narrated by Ibn Abbas. When Allah's Apostle was on his deathbed, and in the house there were some people among whom was Umar ibn al-Khattab, the Prophet said, "Come, let me write for you a statement after which you will not go astray." Umar said, "The Prophet is seriously ill, and you have the Quran, so the book of Allah is enough for us." The people present in the house differed and quarreled. Some said, "Go near, so that the Prophet may write for you a statement after which you will not go astray," while the others said as Umar said. When they caused a hue and cry before the Prophet, Allah's Apostle said, "Go away," narrated Ubaidullah. Ibn Abbas used to say, it was very unfortunate that Allah's Apostle was prevented from writing that statement for them because of their disagreement and noise. It was Muhammad who demanded a pen and paper for himself to write a statement. The allegedly illiterate Muhammad was able to read and write after all. His followers who were present did not grasp the magnitude or the implications of such a request, since they truly believed that he was illiterate. After all, he was the messenger of Allah, who could not possibly tell a lie. They thought that he was delirious and did not know what he was saying. The fact is that it is exactly when a person is delirious that the truth comes out of him, because one is not in full control of one's faculties, which would otherwise have prohibited him from telling the truth. Muhammad had been deceiving all his followers for almost 23 years, and in this manner he made them believe that he was being inspired by Allah. He had mastered the perfect scam and succeeded and is still succeeding, even as we are speaking today, into having his followers believe all his lies and fabrications in his Quran. Sunan of Abu Dawood Hadith 2993, narrated by Yazid bin Abdullah. We were at Mirbad. A man with disheveled hair and holding a piece of red skin in his hand came. We said, "You appear to be a Bedouin." He said, "Yes." We said, "Give us this piece of skin in your hand." He then gave it to us and we read it. It contained the text, "From Muhammad, Apostle of Allah, to Bani Zuhair ibn Uqaysh. If you bear witness that there is no God but Allah and that Muhammad is the Apostle of Allah, offer prayer, pay zakat, pay the fifth from the booty and the portion of the Prophet and his special portion, Safi, you will be under the protection of Allah and his Apostle." We then asked, "Who wrote this document for you?" He replied, "The Apostle of Allah." The writing on the piece of skin was done by Muhammad and no one else. Al-Tirmidhi Hadith 96, narrated by Abdullah bin Amr. Allah's Messenger went out and he had in his hand 2 books. He said, "Do you know what these 2 books are?" We said, "Allah's Messenger, we do not know, but only that you inform us." Thereupon he said, "This one which my right hand possesses is a book from the Lord of the worlds. It contains the names of the inmates of paradise and the name of their forefathers and those of their tribes. It is most exhaustive, and nothing will be added to it, nor anything eliminated from it up to eternity." He then said, "This one in my left hand is a book from the Lord of the worlds. It contains the names of the denizens of hell, and the names of their forefathers and their tribes. It is also exhaustive to the end, and nothing will be added to it, nor anything will be eliminated from it." The companion said, "Allah's Messenger, if this is the case, then where lies the use of doing a deed if the affair is already decided?" Ladies and gentlemen, the most important item in this story is that it compromises the assertions by his followers that he was illiterate, since the only way possible for Muhammad to have known the extensive contents of the 2 books so as to differentiate between them was if he could read, especially since they were not revealed to him by either Gabriel or Allah. This was not a case of inspiration, but of definite reading and evaluating the information within. Just as important for the listeners to know is the comment made by his followers regarding the concept of predestination that fills many of the verses of the Quran. Even they, who were among the most illiterate, the most unlearned and most superstitious people in Arabia, were astute enough to understand the futility of life under the concept or dogma of predestination. If people are predestined, then they have no free will to make choices, and hence there will be no need for religion, no need for prophethood, and no need for Muhammad, for Satan, or the Quran. And last but not least, the icing on the cake, as they say. Surah Al-Ankabut 29.48. "And thou wast not able to recite, Tatlu, a book before this book came, nor art thou able to transcribe it, Takhutuhu, with thy right hand." This is an extremely illuminating verse which makes it clear that Muhammad, before his Quranic revelations, could neither recite nor write them down, since he was ignorant of them. Allah makes it clear that if Muhammad had known previous revelations, he would have transcribed them, that is, write them down. Was Allah wrong?
According to my own observations of the subject, very few people in the world know that there were Judaized Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula centuries before Muhammad. These were native aboriginal pagan Arabs who had converted, without coercion I may add, to the religious beliefs of the Jews who had migrated to Arabia centuries earlier. Can you elaborate?
Our listeners should be made aware that contrary to what they have been taught, that Jews are a religion like Christianity, is totally wrong. Since the word Jew denotes a nationality, people born in the kingdom of Judea or from parents who originated therefrom, whose religion was and still is Musawiyun, the followers of Moses. In Arabic they are called Al-Ta'if al-Musawiyya, meaning the followers of the Mosaic sect or faith. Because of the uniqueness of their beliefs among all the pagan nations surrounding them, after their diaspora, the nationality of the Jews and their religion became synonymous, thus identifying them simply as Jews. In all cases that the word Jew or Jews is heard in this analysis, it means Musawi, the religion of the Jews. Hence, the Jews of Arabia, like the Christians of Arabia, were mostly indigenous, native Arabs of the peninsula and not foreigners. They had willingly converted to these beliefs centuries before Muhammad and his Quran. Although Arab denotes a nationality, one who originated from the Arabian Peninsula or a descendant thereof, it does not necessarily also mean one is a follower of Muhammad, a Muslim, because one can also be a Christian Arab or an Arabized, that is, subjugated peoples such as Egyptians, Algerians, Iraqis, etc., for example, whose land, culture, religion, independence, traditions and language were almost completely taken over by those of the conquering Muhammadan Arabs. In fact, no authentic history of the Arabian Jews exists in the world. The reason there are no records of the historical existence of the Jews of Arabia in the peninsula of the Arabs is simply because Muhammad and his followers completely subjugated or wiped out their villages, their books, their very existence in the year 622 to 635 CE. They did exactly the same to the Christians and pagans of Arabia. Most of what we have are based entirely upon the one-sided and unsubstantiated so-called traditions of the victorious Muhammadan Arabs that luckily contain within them kernels of exceptional facts. According to Arabian records, the Jews of the Hijaz claimed that they had come to settle in Arabia during the kingdom of Solomon, who had trading relations with the Arabs. It is a fact that in the Bible, it is only during the reign of King Solomon that the first mention ever of the Arabs is recorded. Kings 1:10-15. He most certainly sent emissaries and traders with military contingents for security to the Arabs, especially among the coastal areas for the trade routes to Africa and most probably India. Since according to Muhammadan traditions, the Queen of Sheba was allegedly from the Arabian Yemen, then the above Jewish tradition is not baseless. The second immigration by the Jews, according to the Jews, took place in 587 BC, when King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, destroyed Jerusalem and dispersed the Jews. The Arabian Jews claimed that several of their tribes at that time had come to settle in Wadi al-Qura, Taima, and Yathrib, as mentioned by Al-Baladuri, Futuh al-Buldan. As a matter of fact, what is more concretely established is that when in AD 70, the Romans massacred tens of thousands of Jews in Judea, and then in AD 132 forced many of them from that land, many of the Jewish tribes fled to find asylum in the Hijaz, a territory that is contiguous to the south of Judea. There, being agriculturists among other things, they settled wherever they found water springs and greenery and occupied the fertile lands. Aila, Maqna, Tabuk, Taima, Wadi al-Qura, Fadak, and Khaybar came under their control in that very period, and the tribes of Bani Qurayza, Bani Nadir, Bani Bahdal, and Bani Qaynuqa, who also came in the same period and settled around Yathrib. They then built up their own communal village and called it Medina, meaning our country in Hebrew, in memory of Judea. Yathrib became a suburb of Medina, settled mostly by pagan Arabs such as Al-Aus and Khazraj. Among the tribes that settled in Yathrib, Medina, the Bani al-Nadir and Bani Qurayza were more prominent, for they belonged to the Kohen or priestly class. They were looked upon as of noble descent and enjoyed religious leadership among their co-religionists. It is reported in the traditions that the Qurayza were allied to the Khazraj tribe, while the other two tribes, the Nadir and Qaynuqa, were allied to the Aus. According to Arabian tradition, the first Himyarite kingdom from the tribe of Himyar in southwest Arabia, where modern Yemen is situated, was established in about 130 BCE and lasted till 525 CE. This kingdom stretched over the Yemen in the south to Hadramaut and the town of Najran in the north. Among the 9 kings known to historians of this dynasty, Abu Karib As'ad Kamil is reported to have conquered Persia and later embraced the faith of the Jews and propagated it among his subjects. Ibn Ishaq, page 6-19. It is not commonly known that the last Himyarite king, Dun Nawas, was of the faith of the Jews. According to Al-Tabari, he died in 525 in his wars with the Abyssinians, who had conquered and subjugated southwestern Arabia. Arabic sources expressly state that the religion of the Jews became widely spread among the Bedouin tribes of southern Arabia, and that converts to the faith of the Jews were also found among the Hamdan, a North Yemenite tribe, especially among the upper strata of society. Arab historians also attest to the fact that the Judaized tribes of Arabia always sided with the pagan Arabs against the African Abyssinians. In about AD 450, the great flood of Yemen occurred. As a result of this, different tribes of the people of Sabah were compelled to leave Yemen and disperse in different parts of Arabia and beyond. Thus, the Bani Ghassan went to settle in Syria, Bani Lakhm in Hira, Iraq, Bani Khuza'a between Jeddah and Mecca, and the Aus and the Khazraj went to settle in Yathrib. By the time of the 5th century, The original Israelite Jews had so totally assimilated into the Arabian environment that extremely few Hebrew names existed amongst them. Their tribal structure was Arabian. Their alliances were with pagan Arabian tribes. They married and intermarried and were closely associated by blood ties with these tribes to such an extent that the Jews of one tribe fought the Jews of another tribe. Of the 12 tribes that had settled in Hijaz, none except the Beni Zawra retained its Hebrew name. In fact, there is nothing in the poetry of the Jewish poets of the pre-Islamic days to distinguish it from the poetry of the Arab poets in language, ideas, and themes. Since the Jews and Arabs are Semites, they are also physically indistinguishable from each other. By the time of Muhammad, the original Jews had given up their Hebrew culture and language, even their Hebrew names, and had become almost entirely Arabized by a long process of assimilation with the converted Arabian tribes by intermarrying with them. Thus, by the beginning of the 7th century, the majority of Arabian Jews were actually Judaized Arabs who had converted or married into the older but much diluted Israelites, whom the Quran الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, that is, those Arabs who had willingly and without coercion converted to the religion of the Jews. Their language, their dress, and their poetry became indistinguishable from other Arabs. Al-Jumahi devotes a section of his biographies, Tabaqat al-Shu'ara, to the Jewish poets of Al-Madinah and its environs. Abu al-Faraj al-Isbahani, in his Al-Aghani, cites a number of Jewish poets in Arabia. In summation, the only difference between the Judaized Arabs and the pagan Arabs in the peninsula was their religion. Our listeners should clearly be aware that the following are the Muhammadan one-sided traditions of what allegedly transpired. As usual with the Muhammadan traditions, there are no primary or even secondary, independent and reliable eyewitness reports to assert or contradict these alleged traditions. Al-Baqarah 2.62. Those who believe and those who are Jews, الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, and Christians and Sabians. Al-Nisa 4.46. Some of those who are Jews, الَّذِينَ هَادُوا. An-Nisa 4.160. Because of the wrongdoing of the Jews, الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, we forbade them good things which were before made lawful unto them. From the linguistic point of view, the Quran should have said Al-Yahud, the Jews, instead of الَّذِينَ هَادُوا, those who هادوا became Jews, if it meant Jews only and not converts. The most astounding realization based upon the Hadith is that their belief in the one and only God of Israel never changed or wavered among these Judaized Arabs to such an extent that even when the males of the Qurayza tribe were being butchered, 600 to 900 men and boys, by Muhammad and his companions, only 2 of them accepted that Muhammad was the messenger of Allah. Their incredible tenacity to stick to their religious beliefs and to deny Muhammad what they clearly knew were his utterly false claims to prophethood is attested to by the fact that among the thousands of Jews and Judaized Arabs, less than 10 people were willing to convert to the cult of Muhammad, even upon pain of death. As a testament to their incredible display of loyalty to and their refusal to betray their beliefs and traditions, in the following hadith, Muhammad remarks ruefully upon this tenacity. Sahih al-Bukhari 5.277, narrated by Abu Huraira. The Prophet said, had only 10 Jews believed me, all the Jews would have definitely believed me. From among the thousands of Jews in Arabia, not even 10 were willing to submit to Muhammad's false pretenses and tyranny. This is the ultimate measure of martyrdom. Before Muhammad appeared on the scene, there was no religious or racial discrimination between the Jews and the Arabs, especially since both are Semites. The concept of ethnic intolerance did not exist among the pagan Arabs until Muhammad created it in his Quran to justify the destruction of the Judaized and Christianized Arabs for having refused to accept him as a prophet. Over the centuries, the Jews and Judaized Arabs became economically much stronger than the pagan Arabs. Since they had emigrated from the more civilized and culturally advanced countries of Judea, Syria, and Iraq, they knew many such arts as were unknown to the Arabs. They also enjoyed trade relations with the outside world. Those Jews of Israelite descent or indigenous Arab converts were integrated and accepted by the pagan natives. It is important to repeat yet again that the pagan Arabs were almost entirely nomadic people who abhorred and looked with contempt at the concept of tilling the land. Ibn Ishaq, pages 6 to 18, there are numerous passages that attest to the above facts. The stories about the Tubba, Qurayza, Medina, Mecca, etc. are very clear in showing the incredible intertwining between the Jews and the Arab tribes to such an extent that they are indistinguishable from each other excepting for their religious beliefs. According to Ibn Ishaq, it was two Jewish rabbis who saved both the Medina and Mecca from the wrath of Al-Tubba, pages 6 to 12. Philip Hitti, in his monumental History of the Arabs, asserts that it was the Jews who introduced the following fruits to the Arabians: apples, apricots, watermelons, pomegranates, lemons, oranges, sugarcane, bananas, and almonds, among others. The greatest and most important contribution by the Jews to Arabian agriculture and subsequently their heritage was the introduction of the palm tree, which existed mostly in the fertile land of Iraq. It is called tamar in Arabic, whose root resides in the Hebrew tamar, meaning dates. Furthermore, each of their tribes had to enter into alliances with one or another powerful pagan Arab tribe for the sake of its own protection, so that no other powerful tribe should overawe it by its might. Because of this, they had not only to take part in the mutual wars of the Arabs, but they often had to go to war in support of the Arab tribe to which their tribe was tied in alliance against another Judaized tribe which was allied to the enemy tribe. In Yathrib, the Bani Qurayza and Bani Nadir were allies of the Aus, while the Bani Qaynuqa were allied to the Khazraj. A few years before Muhammad's emigration to the Medina, these Judaized tribes had confronted each other in support of their respective allies in the war that took place between the Aus and Khazraj at Bu'as. The Aus and Khazraj were the ones who welcomed and protected Muhammad in Medina and who were called the Ansar, meaning supporters or helpers of Muhammad. Because of their proximity and blood relations with their Judaized Arab brothers and sisters, they were the most prone to believe in the one and only God. They were the same who later, after the death of Muhammad, had to contend with the religious and political discrimination fostered upon them by the Qurayshites. The Jews, Judaized Arabs of Medina, were almost totally Arab. They were, after all, natives of Arabia and not foreign intruders or actual Jews, and even if they were originally from Judea, by the way, there was no Palestine, they became fully absorbed and assimilated by the time of Muhammad. The Judaized Arabs at the beginning welcomed Muhammad as a brother monotheist who was attempting to convert his pagan Arabian tribes to the belief in the one and only God. Unfortunately, Muhammad's original perception of his mission as the Moses of the pagan Arabs slowly transformed itself into a more militant and uncompromising self-esteem as a prophet to all mankind and especially to the Jews. Muhammad actually started to perceive himself and believe that he was the promised Messiah. The Judaized Arabs, for very good reasons, refused to accept Muhammad as a prophet, especially since he was not bringing about any new concept or ideas which were either equal to or superior to theirs. Because of his grandiose claims to prophethood and his alleged revelations, they constantly questioned and ridiculed him, especially since his so-called revelations totally contradicted the original versions in their Hebrew Bible. These humiliating but fully warranted disputations became intolerable effrontery to him personally and a threat to his innocent claims, which were adding to his difficulty in converting the pagans to his cultic beliefs. In the end, he had no choice but to exterminate such witnesses to his lies and pretensions. Muhammad's personal legacy of hate for the Jews and Christians who refused to believe in him is inscribed in his Quran. The entirety of the Quran, after all, is actually Muhammad's own alter ego, and thus replete with innumerable verses attacking, insulting, denigrating, and inciting Muhammad's followers against Judaized Arabs. Systematically and with aforethought, Muhammad broke all treaties with the pagan, Judaized, and Christianized Arabian tribes, or found other excuses to slaughter, convert, subjugate, or enslave them.
The followers of Muhammad have been indoctrinated by their scholars about the alleged divine origins of the Quran, and the overwhelming majority do not know and have not been informed about the stories in the hadiths and some verses in the Quran that actually point to the contrary. Will you elaborate?
Your observations are correct, and I shall recite the following more important and relevant examples. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 4.814, narrated by Anas. There was a Christian who embraced Islam and read Surah Al-Baqarah and Al-Imran, and he used to write the revelations for the Prophet. Later on, he returned to Christianity again, and he used to say, Muhammad knows nothing but what I have written for him. Ladies and gentlemen, this story relates to the fact that one of Muhammad's scribes used to modify his revelations so that they rhymed better with the full knowledge of Muhammad. This made the scribe realize that they could not possibly have been divinely revealed if a mere mortal like him was allowed and able to alter them. So he left Muhammad and his Islam and reverted back to Christianity. The following is a shortened version of a hadith regarding Muhammad's first alleged violent encounter with the angel Gabriel. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 1.3, narrated by Aisha. Thereupon he caught me for the third time and pressed me, and then released me and said, اقرأ باسم ربك الذي خلق الإنسان من علق. Read in the name of your Lord who has created man from a clot. Then Allah's apostle returned with the inspiration and with his heart beating severely. Then he went to Khadija bint Khuwaylid and said, Cover me, cover me. They covered him till his fear was over, and after that he told her everything that had happened and said, I fear that something may happen to me. Khadija replied, Never, by Allah, Allah will never disgrace you. Khadija then accompanied him to her cousin, Waraqa bin Nawfal bin Sa'd bin Abdul Uzza, who during the pre-Islamic period became a Christian and used to write with Hebrew letters. He would write from the Gospel in Hebrew as much as Allah wished him to write. Another version of the same event goes like this. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 6.478, narrated by Aisha again. Khadija then took him to Waraqa bin Nawfal, the son of Khadija's paternal uncle. Waraqa had been converted to Christianity in the pre-Islamic period and used to write in Arabic, and write of the Gospel in Arabic as much as Allah wished him to write. The listener should be made aware of the transition in the two hadiths, from writing in Hebrew to writing in Arabic. This was part and parcel of the methods used by the later followers of Muhammad to deliberately distance Waraqa from the Jews as much as possible, to make believe that the Quran was not influenced by anyone outside of Muhammad. When one studies, and I repeat the word studies, the Quran, one will have no choice but to conclude that the Quran is based almost entirely on plagiarized, plundered, pirated and or perverted concepts, precepts, thoughts and ideas from the traditions, fetishes and scriptures of the pagan Arabs, Jews, Christians and Zoroastrians. In the final analysis, the only new revelations that the Quran introduces are the enormous number of hate-mongering, warmongering, terrorizing and racist verses that fill its chapters.
The Arabs claim that they are descendants of Ishmael and Abraham, that Abraham and Ishmael actually built the foundations of the Kaaba. Since there is no mention in the Bible of Abraham and Ishmael having ever set foot in Arabia, and there is no mention in the Bible of Arabia, Arabs, Allah, Mecca, or the Kaaba, on what foundations are their claims supported?
Like almost all the other claims made by the Arabs, they are all a mirage, and their foundations are as solid as the shifting sands of the Arabian desert. Before Muhammad and his Quran, the pagan Arabs had absolutely no knowledge of Abraham, Ishmael, or any other biblical character. To give himself and his followers an ancestry worthy of divine revelations, Muhammad plagiarized, plundered, pirated, and or perverted all that his followers have from the traditions, scriptures, and fetishes of the Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, and pagan Arabians. Being consummate pirates, he and his followers did not only plunder wealth, peoples, and assets, but they upgraded to pirating even the religious beliefs of others to such an extent that they claim that all the previous biblical Hebrew prophets are theirs. They did the same to the churches, synagogues, and temples of the conquered peoples, by turning them into mosques. For 300 years after the death of Muhammad, his followers were able to concoct all the traditions that allegedly connected the Arabs to Ishmael and Abraham. Let us look at the facts. When one investigates all the names of the Arabs at the time of Muhammad, especially those mentioned in the Ahadith, not one of them carried a biblical name. Moreover, it is inconceivable that none of them was called either Abraham or Ishmael if they truly were their alleged ancestors, while Muhammad's name is used among at least 80% of his later male followers. The three lines concocted by Muhammad's later followers are historically and logically utterly improbable and incompatible with the original biblical version. Nowhere in all the poetry of pagan Arabia were Abraham or Ishmael mentioned. The Muhammadan Arabs used the same Bible that they assert had been altered and or perverted by the Jews and Christians to find their alleged ancestry from among the descendants of Ishmael. Not only are these so-called descendants not mentioned anywhere in Arabic folklore prior to Muhammad, there are of course no documents of any kind to back up their fanciful and imaginary ancestral tree. Moreover, the Ahadith themselves are at substantial variance with each other. According to Arab historians, there are allegedly three types of Arabs. One, Al-Arab al-Abba'ida, those original Arabs who had been destroyed by Allah for their unbelief, such as Al-Ad and Thammud. Two, Al-Arab al-Arabiya, who are the original Arabs of the peninsula descended from the line of Shem, Arphaxad, Shelah, Eber, Yaqtan, Jurhum. Three, Al-Arab al-Musta'riba, who are the Arabized descendants of the Hebrew Ishmael and Ra'la, daughter of Burad al-Jurhumi, through Adnan and Ma'ad. As can be seen, most of the names are plagiarized from the Bible and Arabized to make them sound original and authentic, which of course they are neither. According to their alleged traditions, Ishmael ended up marrying an Arabian woman and was taught Arabic by the Jurhum tribe who adopted him. They had to teach him Arabic because his native language was Hebrew. Hence Muhammad and his followers are descended from the Hebrews and are in fact not pure Arabs. It took Muhammad's followers almost 300 years of plagiarism and fraudulence to create a worthy ancestry for him and for themselves. Not one of each is based on any solid fact, either documentary or folkloric, only wishful and fanciful thinking. Dear listeners, first and foremost, we would like to state clearly that we are not against the followers of Muhammad, who are actually the first and worst victims of the cult of Muhammadan Islam, but we are without a shadow of a doubt against the teachings of Muhammad's Quran. Please bear in mind that none of the followers of Muhammad are born evil, but almost all of them are brainwashed by the Quran that turns them into hate-mongering, warmongering, racist, and unthinking individuals. We have chosen the male followers of Muhammad only because they are the perfect replicas, clones of Muhammad. They have had no choice in the matter since they have been programmed and indoctrinated by their religious leaders to believe that Muhammad was the most perfect male being that has ever walked the surface of this earth. Hence, all his male followers must emulate his sunnah, that is, his deeds, behavior, thoughts, and sayings. We have purposefully ignored the female followers of Muhammad, since Muhammad and his cloned male followers consider them as inferior beings, not higher in intellect than domestic animals, harbingers of evil thoughts, seducers of men, as well as constituting the largest number of the dwellers of hell for being disobedient to their husbands. We do not say these things to insult or out of malice to them, but because this was and is exactly how Muhammad and his male followers perceive them, and the hadiths are replete with stories that are insulting, humiliating, outrageous, and threatening towards all the females of the human species. The male followers of Muhammad use the Quran and hadiths to enslave, terrorize, subjugate, and control the body, spirit, and intellect of their females. We believe without any reservations, that the salvation of Muhammad and Islam resides in the enfranchisement and liberation of their female believers. Since we support wholeheartedly the enlightenment and empowerment of all the female followers of Muhammad, we cannot include them as carrying the same characteristics as the males. It is a fact that the male followers of Muhammad have to live in a warped and unreal twilight zone of an intellectually and emotionally dysfunctional world of denial, denial, denial. Because the moment they agree with any of our observations or statements, that would be the very beginning of the disintegration of their whole belief system. Our audience should be aware of the following characteristics of the male followers of Muhammad, irrespective of nationality, race, color, or culture. They exhibit an obscene degree of hypocrisy, mendacity, and institutionalized racism. These are compounded with a pathological and depraved indifference to facts, reality, mercy, compassion, logic, morality, justice, knowledge, religion, veracity, language, and loyalty. Their perverted view of unbelievers, 80% of humanity or 5.5 billion human beings, is based entirely on the enormous number of verses in the Quran and Sunnah that are hate-mongering, war-mongering, discriminatory, mendacious, and vile, that permeate their chapters. Those unbelievers are, without exception, all Christians, all Buddhists, all Hindus, all Sikhs, all Jews, all animists, etc. Not a single one of these male Muhammadan Muslims can ever counter any statement or observation made in this series about the Quran or Hadiths, using logic or knowledge, but only ignoramus, emotional, and outrageous outbursts of unrestrained anger at being incapable of disproving any of our conclusions. They are the only followers in the whole world of a cult belief system that invariably show their resentment by holding their holy book, the Quran, in one hand and weapons of death and destruction in the other, while screaming the terror verse of Allahu Akbar. They are masters at the art of denial and the best in the world for blaming all others for their own misfortunes, ignorance, shortcomings, and stupidity. Their hatred of the Jews especially is as intense, as cowardly and lopsided as that of the Nazis, whom they make every effort to emulate, in spite of the fact that there are over 1.3 billion followers of Muhammad against only a tiny 13 million Jews worldwide. They are willing to commit suicide only because they actually believe, in their warped, perverted, and indoctrinated mind, that they will end up having unlimited sexual, sensual, and carnal pleasures with 72 virgins after death, the very same pleasures that they are denied in real life on earth. No matter how many facts are shown to them based entirely on the Arabic language and their own books, they would block all this evidence and recede into the abyss of mendacity, of denial, and the mirage of alleged past glories and fantasies. In short, they have mastered the art of intellectual, theological, and political masturbation. Let us now share with you a few examples about these characteristics, some of which may overlap. Hypocrisy. They demand justice and equality under the law in the Western democracies, but they deny any of them in their own Muhammadan Muslim states to all so-called unbelievers. Mendacity. They claim that the Quran was a divine revelation, when in fact every biblical reference therein contradicts the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. Institutionalized racism. It is a fact that they hate and attack all those who do not believe as they do, 80% of humanity, as well as they blatantly discriminate against their own believing females. Indifference to facts and reality. No matter how much one can prove to them based entirely on the Arabic language of the Quran, Hadith, and their books. The contradictions between the Quran and the Bible, they declare that the Jews and Christians had perverted these books, while at the same time they exhaustively quote from these same books, and the Quran uses them as witnesses to its own veracity. Moreover, although they watch daily on their TV regarding the depraved behavior of other followers of Muhammad around the world, such as suicide bombings, butcherings, etc., they will deny all and everything. Indifference to mercy and compassion. The world watches aghast and in terror the bestial acts committed in the name of Allah, not only against unbelievers, but also against other Muhammadan Muslims of a different sect or political affiliation. Indifference to morality and justice. their Sharia laws discriminate against not only unbelievers but also against all the female followers of Muhammad as well as other sects of Muhammadan Islam. Indifference to knowledge and religion. They deliberately destroy the temples and objects of reverence that belong not only to unbelievers, but even to the shrines of other sects of Muhammadan Islam, and teach their children that the earth is flat and that Muhammadan Islam is the only true religion. Indifference to language. They deliberately deceive and mislead the unwary, and those who do not understand the Arabic language, that Islam means peace, which is not true, since it only means submission. That Allah is God, when in fact Allah is not God but the name of the supreme pagan rock god of the Quraysh tribe in Mecca long before Muhammad and his Quran. Indifference to veracity and loyalty. No true follower of Muhammad can ever be loyal to any state which is not a Muhammadan Muslim state. The Quran, in perfectly clear and unambiguous Arabic, forbids the followers of Muhammad to befriend Jews, Christians, and all unbelievers or be under their control. The male followers of Muhammad who have found security, freedom, and financial success by escaping from their own God-forsaken countries now do their very best to undermine the very states that have given them citizenship, to pull them down into the abyss and dark ages of Muhammadan Islam. To understand this total illogic, our listeners must remember the following. A belief is not merely an idea that the mind possesses. It is, in fact, an idea that totally possesses the mind. The male followers of Muhammad win their arguments only through terror. Muhammad did the same in his days when he had anyone criticizing him murdered. We believe that it is better to die once a free human being than to live an eternity as a slave. We would like our listeners to ponder the above issues and use them as means to counter the lies and deceptions perpetrated by the followers of Muhammad against all those who are ignorant of the facts. We are grateful to all of you who listen to our series, to those who subscribe, and to those who spread the word about it. We need your support and comments so that those who are against us realize that it is wake-up time about the facts regarding the cult belief system of Muhammadan Islam, and that they cannot anymore fool or terrorize all the people of the world.
The Muhammadan Arabs especially tell the world that the Quran asserts that Abraham was attempting to sacrifice Ishmael, and not, as the original story that appears only in the Bible tells us, that it was Isaac. What are the facts?
Isaac was Sarah's only son, and hence the one who was to have been offered for sacrifice in the Torah. Genesis chapter 22 verse 1. And it came to pass after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, take now your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell you. And they came to the place which God had told him. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. And Abraham stretched out his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. And the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven, and said, Abraham, Abraham, lay not your hand upon the lad, nor do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. The version in the Quran, Surah 37, 100 to 107, is completely incompatible with and different from the biblical narrative. Moreover, the Quran does not assert or allege that it was Ishmael who was being offered for a sacrifice, as the later Muhammadan scholars in desperation concocted as an alternative story. The biblical verses above show repeatedly and with great precision that it is always Isaac and only Isaac who is considered as Abraham's foremost son, as in the repeated description of your son, your only son, Isaac. Isaac's name appears in association with Ishmael in 4 surahs. His name appears alone, without Ishmael, in association with Abraham and Jacob in 8 surahs. The Quran mentions Isaac's name on 16 occasions, while that of Ishmael only 8 times. It is a great insult to the human intellect, as well as a pitiable and pitiful endeavor, that the followers of Muhammad attempt their best to pervert, contort and twist recorded history, facts, reality and language in order to give themselves a worthy ancestry at any cost. According to the alleged unsubstantiated and totally fabricated Arab traditions, and contrary to the original stories from the biblical records, Ishmael is their father just as Isaac was the father of the Israelites. From this very outset, let the listeners be aware that the above so-called traditions did not exist in the mind of the pagan Arabians prior to their alleged revelations in Muhammad's Quran and later Hadiths. In this chapter, I shall show the readers the two versions of the story of Ishmael, that of the original of the Bible and that of the Quran, for them to compare and contrast. According to the Bible, Abraham was of the Hebrew, Ibri tribe, Genesis 14:13. And there came one who had escaped and told Abram the Hebrew. The Hebrews were one among hundreds of Semitic tribes that lived in the land of what we call now Iraq. If historians are correct in surmising that the Semitic tribes of Iraq and Syria originated from Arabia, then the Hebrews were one of these tribes. If this were the case, then Abraham and Ishmael cannot also be the progenitors of the Arabs from whom they allegedly originate. According to the falsified and unsubstantiated Arab traditions, Abraham journeyed with the baby Ishmael and his mother Hagar to the valley of Mecca, and together later on raised the foundations of the Kaaba. Surah Al-Baqarah 2:1-7. And remember, Abraham and Ismail raised the foundations of the house. Our Lord, make of us Muslims, bowing to thy will, and of our progeny a people Muslim, bowing to thy will. The falsification of history, the contortion of facts and reality are the forte of most of the so-called scholars of Islam. They know full well that there exists no such Arab tradition anywhere in either the pagan Arabian records nor in the oral traditions of these Arabs to substantiate any of their allegations. If the Muhammadan scholars are correct, then Allah must have spoken in Hebrew to Abraham, and the first language heard near the Kaaba was also Hebrew and not Arabic. It is a measure of their intellectual desperation that the Muhammadan scholars even contradict the Quran, which asserts in several verses that neither Muhammad nor the pagan Arabs had any knowledge of the previous revelations. Surah Al-Baqarah 2.78. And there are among them illiterates who know not the book. أُمِّيُّونَ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ الْكِتَابَ. The Quranic word Ummi is deliberately misinterpreted as illiterate by the Sunni Orthodox Muhammadans. Critical scholars such as Tabari in his tafsir point out that this curious adjective is invariably used in the Quran in contradistinction and or in opposition to the people of the book, Ahl al-Kitab, and should therefore be taken to mean one ignorant of holy scriptures and or the earlier revealed religions, that is, unscriptured. The Almighty made it crystal clear to Abraham by emphasizing that his only son Isaac was the one from his first wife Sarah and not from his concubine Hagar, thus eliminating Ishmael from both the attempted sacrifice as well as from the blessing of inheriting the promised land. We are here confronted by an extremely serious and monumental dilemma. Either the Bible is false or the Quran is. Both cannot be correct when they are giving contradictory versions of the same events. Since the Bible preceded the Quran by at least 2,100 years, one has to believe that the angel Gabriel gave Muhammad a completely altered version of the Torah from that which was given to Moses face to face by the Almighty, and not passed down second-hand and adulterated by an intermediary as in the case of the Quran. One has to assume that Gabriel deliberately changed God's Bible, which is also inconceivable, since it is impossible to believe that any omniscient, merciful and compassionate God would have ever revealed all the discrepancies, hate-mongering, war-mongering, discrimination, grammatical errors, as well as the historical and character dislocations, mendacities, abnormalities, inconsistencies, time and space displacements that permeate the Quranic versions of the biblical events. Then only one conclusion can be possible: that every letter, every word, every verse and every chapter in the Quran are the product of Muhammad's personal thoughts and imaginings. the secretions of his mind based upon his distorted recollections of stories and tales he had heard from Jewish and Christian individuals. They actually represent Muhammad's own alter ego, but cleverly projected it to the unsuspecting mouth of Allah, the supreme pagan rock god of Mecca, embedded into the corner wall of the Kaaba called the Black Stone. The author of the Quran, Muhammad, Allah, and Gabriel are one and the same. They are all Muhammad himself, while Allah, Gabriel, and Satan are mere props required to give his alleged revelations sanctity and divine authority.
The Battle of Yamama was a turning point in the history of the Quran. Will you elaborate?
It was due to the aftermath of this battle that the followers of Muhammad were forced to put the Quran to writing. At the very beginning of Islam, the Quran was being memorized and not yet compiled into a written form, especially since as long as Muhammad was alive and receiving revelations, over a long period of 23 years, new surahs were being added while others were being revised, deleted, and or abrogated. All verses in the Quran that speak of it as a book are wrong and deceiving, since the Quran was never in book form while Muhammad was alive. When Muhammad died, there existed no singular codex of the Quranic text. That is, there was not in existence any collection of revelations in a final review form. Also, there was not a single memorizer who knew all the verses of the Quran. All these verses were scattered in the memories of hundreds of Huffaz memorizers. Without a doubt, Muhammad failed utterly in his primary mission of giving his followers a single authorized scripture, because in reality he died without authenticating a unified codex of the Quran. The fact that he left his followers with 7 modes or versions of the Quran speaks volumes about his failure. The consequences of this failure became paramount when his followers were reciting different versions of the alleged words of Allah. This failure has endured and continues for the last 1400 years. All attempts by his present followers to gloss over this fact are doomed to fail, since the records of Muhammadan scholars in the centuries after his death attest to otherwise. After the death of Muhammad, many Arab tribes broke into revolt against the state of Medina. Khalifa Abu Bakr organized 11 corps to deal with the apostates. The Battle of Yamama was fought in December 632 AD in the plain of Aqraba, in the region of Yamama, between the forces of Khalifa Abu Bakr and Musaylima, a self-proclaimed prophet like Muhammad. Musaylima and most of his followers were massacred by the armies of Abu Bakr, but at the same time, hundreds of those men who had memorized different sections of the Quran also perished, and with them many verses of the Quran. As the memorizers Huffaz were becoming extinct through slaughter in battle or otherwise, Umar ibn al-Khattab recommended that the Quran should be committed to writing. Abu Bakr entrusted the task to Zayd bin Thabit of Al-Madinah, who used to be Muhammad's secretary. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 6.509, narrated by Zayd bin Thabit. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq sent for me when the people of Yamama had been killed, i.e., a number of the Prophet's companions who fought against Musaylima. I went to him and found Umar ibn al-Khattab sitting with him. Abu Bakr said to me, Umar has come to me and said, casualties were heavy among the Qurra of the Quran, i.e., those who knew the Quran by heart, on the day of the Battle of Yamama. And I'm afraid that more heavy casualties may take place among the Qurra on other battlefields, whereby a large part of the Quran may be lost. Therefore I suggest you, Abu Bakr, order that the Quran be collected. So I started looking for the Quran and collecting it from what was written on palm stalks, thin white stones, and also from the men who knew it by heart, till I found the last verse at Surah At-Tawbah, repentance, with Abi Khuzaym al-Ansari, and I did not find it with anybody else. All were brought together and the text was constructed. If it were true that there were many memorizers of the Quran, why then did they need to collect the Quranic verses from diverse and unrelated documents, such as leaf stalk, bone, parchments, as well as the memories of men? From the above quotes, it is clear that the pagan Arabs had not by then mastered the art of writing or the use of writing materials such as clay, papyrus, metal sheets, or even skins of animals. The Arabs of the Hijaz, contrary to all the efforts of Muhammadan propaganda, were mostly illiterate, uneducated, uncivilized, nomadic, and semi-nomadic people. Abu Bakr and Umar recognized that there were other masters of the text of the Quran, such as Abdullah bin Mas'ud, Ubayd ibn Ka'b, Mu'ad ibn Jabal, Ali bin Abi Talib, and others, alongside Zayd bin Thabit, who were authorities of equal, if not more, standing with him, and who were qualified to produce authentic codices of the Quran in written form. The manuscript compiled by Zayd, though highly prized as it was, nevertheless was not regarded with any greater authority than the others once these began to be put together. And it was for this reason, therefore, that Zayd's codex was not publicly imposed on the whole community as the officially sanctioned text of the Quran. Zayd's text was, in fact, virtually concealed after its compilation. Upon the death of Umar, it passed into the private keeping of Hafsa, his daughter. Far from being given official publicity, it was set aside and given no publicity at all. By the time Uthman became Khalifa, although the other codices were gaining prominence in the various provinces, this codex had in fact receded into the private custody of Hafsa, Muhammad's widow, who simply kept it indefinitely in her personal care. It may have been compiled under official supervision, but it was never regarded as the actual official and sole authenticity of the text of the Quran. It had become just one of many codices of equal authority that had been put together at roughly the same time. It is vital to point out to our listeners that the compilations of the Quran were not under the supervision of Muhammad to give it authority and sanctity, but done without his authority by his followers to mitigate against the very real chance that it would have otherwise been lost. In other words, and contrary to what Muhammad's followers Hawas believe, there was no divine guidance in its collection. Hence, to standardize the Quran into a singular codex, the third Khalifa, Uthman bin Affan, instructed Zayd bin Thabit to compile a second revised edition of the Quran. In 651 AD, Uthman bin Affan canonized the Medina Codex and ordered all 6 other versions of the Quran that were originally collected by the most intimate companions of Muhammad to be destroyed. Thus, based entirely upon the Muhammadan records themselves, any self-respecting, intelligent person must come to the conclusion that there were major discrepancies in the readings of the different texts that necessitated the draconian instruction to burn the alleged holy words of Allah. The claims by the followers of Muhammad that the Quran that they have today is exactly the same as that revealed to Muhammad 1400 years ago is a blatant lie, as the Muhammadan Muslim records themselves clearly show. The Quran that we have today is actually the product of almost 300 years of editing and altering, and all the denials by Muhammad's followers are desperate attempts to deceive the uninformed.
Are the biblical names in the Quran based upon pagan Arabian Arabic sources?
I must answer this question on 3 levels: historical, ideological, and linguistic. Historically, when one looks up the names of Muhammad's companions and the names of the other pre-Islamic Arabs, one will not find a single biblical name among the pagan Arabs. Names such as Ibrahim, Ismail, Yaqub, Musa, Isa, Dawood, Sulaiman, etc. are missing, which should not be surprising since the pagan Arabs had absolutely no inkling whatsoever that they were in any way associated with Abraham until Muhammad's alleged Quranic revelations. If Abraham and Ishmael were truly the ancestral fathers of the Arabs, then it beggars belief and logic that they forgot them so completely, especially when one takes into account the fact that Muhammad's name is used by over 80% of all the males of his followers even after 1400 years. Moreover, if Abraham and Ishmael were truly the ancestral fathers of the Arabs, it would make the Arabs descendants of the Hebrews, Arabic the daughter of the Hebrew language, and Mecca and the Kaaba holy, shrines for the Jews also. When the above subjects are looked at dispassionately and intelligently, the conclusions arrived at above change the whole dynamic of Muhammadan claims to their language, their shrines, and their mythical history. Ideologically, the Quran repeatedly asserts that both Muhammad and the pagan Arabs had no knowledge of previous revelations. Al-A'raf 7.157. Those who follow the apostle, the unlettered prophet, Al-Rasul al-Nabi al-Ummi. Ash-Shura 42:52. And thus have we by our command sent inspiration to thee. Thou knowest not before what was revelation and what was faith. ما كنت تدري ما الكتاب ولا الإيمان. Yet once more does the Quran assert that the pagan Arabs and Muhammad were ignorant of previous revelations prior to itself. Surah Al-Jum'ah 62.2. He who sent among the unlettered people a messenger from them, هو الذي بعث في الأميين رسولا منهم. The claims by Muhammad and his later followers that the pagan Arabs had any knowledge of Abraham and Ishmael as their ancestors are pure fabrications and blatant lies, especially since they contradict the Quran itself. Linguistically, our listeners should be aware that the Arabic names of the biblical characters are taken from the Syriac Arabic of the Christians who resided in the Byzantine Empire and the Arabian Peninsula. At its broadest definition, Syriac is often used to refer to all Eastern Aramaic languages spoken by various Christian groups. At its most specific, it refers to the classical language of Edessa, which became the liturgical language of Syriac Christianity. In summation, the falsifications of history and theology were needed by both Muhammad and his later followers to give themselves a worthy ancestry in line of the Hebrew prophets, and hence be able to claim the receiving of divine revelations also. Being the best pirates of the desert, it was not enough for Muhammad and his followers to plunder the wealth of the people of the book, but they graduated to become also pirates and plunderers of their beliefs to such a depraved extent that they started claiming the Hebrew prophets and kings as their own. The followers of Muhammad continue unrestrained to create for themselves a history, a lineage, and a cult belief system that are based entirely on the plundering, plagiarizing, pirating, and or perverting of the histories, traditions, beliefs, fetishes, and scriptures of other peoples.
In our chapter about the Jews of Arabia, I mentioned that very few people in the world know that there were Judaized Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula centuries before Muhammad and his Quran. The same is of course also true about the Christians of Arabia, who also preceded Muhammad by at least 300 years. Why do you think this is the case, and who were these Christian Arabs?
In answer to the first part of your questions, it has been and still is the deliberate policy of the Arabian followers of Muhammad not to inform a generally ignorant world that there were Christianized as well as Judaized Arabian tribes in the peninsula long before Muhammad and his Quran. In this way, people would not know that he was influenced enormously by their scriptures and traditions, without which there would have been no Quran. As almost all of our listeners realize now, Muhammad plagiarized, plundered, pirated, and or perverted the scriptures, traditions, and fetishes of the pagan Arabians, the Jews, the Christians, the Zoroastrians, and incorporated them in his Quran. They want the world, including Muhammadan Muslims, to believe the self-evident lies that Muhammad discovered monotheism, that Allah was God, and that he was a prophet. Let us now reveal the facts to those who are willing to listen and to learn. Shortly after the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, in 325 AD under the Emperor Constantine, Christianity started penetrating the Arabian Peninsula through hermits, traders, and or emissaries sent by the Roman emperors to discuss trade relations with the Arabs to get spices and other Eastern products. A long time before Muhammad, Christianity had already spread to Egypt, North Africa, Abyssinia, Syria, and Iraq, and was moving south to the Arabian Peninsula. In AD 450 or 451, the Great Flood of the Yemen occurred. As a result of this, different tribes from the people of Saba were compelled to leave Yemen and disperse in different parts of Arabia and beyond. Thus, the Bani Ghassan went to settle in Syria, Bani Lakhm in Hira, Iraq, Bani Khuza'a between Jeddah and Mecca, and the Aus and the Khazraj went to settle in Yathrib. Under the Byzantine Empire, the Bani Ghassan and other tribes of Arabia near the Syrian frontier, followed the Monophysite Christianity and controlled the northern end of the Great Road up through the Hijaz. In the meantime, the Abyssinians who invaded southern Arabia of the Yemen were also Monophysite. Hence, shortly before Muhammad's arrival on the scene, the Byzantine Empire had three major Christian sects in operation, not necessarily tolerant of each other, and they were the State Church, usually called Greek Orthodox or Malkite, the Jacobite, and the Nestorians. Most were actual Arabians who converted to Christianity and were in contact with the pagan Arabs of the peninsula through tribal affiliations and trading caravans. In fact, early Arabic poetry shows the Christian hermit as a familiar figure, and the same is true in numerous verses of the Quran and the Hadiths. According to the historical records, Muhammad actually plagiarized some very important verses from other poets, both pagan and Christian, and put them in his Quran. Such poets as Imrul Qais, Hassan bin Thabit, Zayd bin Nufail, etc. There were Christian hermitages in Wadi al-Qura, well in the interior of the peninsula, east of the Hijaz, whose monks attended the fairs during the holy forbidden months of the pagan Arabs, where they traded, regaled listeners with stories and recited poetry. The Christians were able to spread the word among the pagans and help increase conversion. Arabic history relates that Christianity was introduced into South Arabia by a Syrian monk called Phimian. The poetry of the pagan Arabians show that they valued their nomadic way of life infinitely more than a settled one, and looked with utter contempt upon agricultural people whom they could rob at will if and when circumstances arose. I would like our listeners to be aware that almost all of the records that are available to the world regarding the history of the Arabian Christians come from the unsubstantiated and one-sided reports left to us by the Mohammedan Muslim victors who forced into conversion, slaughtered or exiled the original native and indigenous population of Arabia's Christians and destroyed all their records and traces from the face of the earth. Since most of the Christians were associated with the civilized society, they too, like the Jews and the Judaized Arabs, occupied the most fertile areas that they could find among the tens of thousands of square miles of otherwise scorching and sterile desert. The chief center of Christianity in southern Arabia was the town of Al-Najran, situated in the one part that was fertile. On the eve of Mohammedan Islam, it had probably the wealthiest population in the area. It was famous for making textiles in which silk was employed. The Yemeni garments that figure so much in early pagan Arabian poetry were manufactured there. It was also famous for its leather and armaments industry. Najran seems to have had a much more advanced political structure than other Arabian towns, including Mecca or Medina. It was ruled by a triumvirate, a Sayyid, an Aqib, and a bishop. The Sayyid acted as chief sheikh in the same tradition of Arab tribal leaders who dealt with all external affairs, exchanged treaties, controlled commerce, acted as host at the periodical fairs, and led military expeditions. Al-Aqib seems to have dealt only with internal affairs such as administering the municipality and policing the city. The bishop was supreme in all ecclesiastical affairs and ruled over all the clergy and monks who formed a considerable section of the community. It was through this town, which became the center of Christianity in the Arabian Peninsula, that the Christian message was spreading. Envied by pagan Arabs generally for the great wealth, the people of Najran were nonetheless held in great esteem for their nobility, and the ancient poets seem to have regarded them as the noblest of the Arabs. This was, of course, at a date much earlier than the false pretensions of the Quraysh of Mecca, whose repute for nobility became only recognized after the spread of Mohammedan Islam and based entirely for their kinship to Muhammad. Like Mecca, the Arabian Peninsula had several other holy places of pilgrimage called also Kaaba, one of which was in Najran even before the arrival of the Christian Arabs. The Byzantine emperor spent a lot of money building a very imposing cathedral as a frontier bastion to impress the pagan Arabs as well as a center to spread Christianity. This is described as a very splendid edifice adorned with marble and mosaic that had to be transported all the way from Syria. Najran remained a Christian city into the Muhammadan Muslim era until its inhabitants were expelled by Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second Khalifa. Most of the exiles went to Iraq, where they founded a town also called Najran. The Arabian Christians endured much less than the fate of the Judaized Arabs, who were mostly slaughtered or enslaved. Both communities suffered enormously and irreversibly at the hands of Muhammad and his followers, under the pretext that Muhammad upon his deathbed instructed his followers that two religions cannot exist in the land of the Muhammadan Muslims. Al-Muwatta Hadith 45.17. Yahya related to me from Malik from Ismail ibn Abi Hakim that he heard Umar ibn al-Aziz, one of the last things that the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said was, "May Allah fight the Jews and the Christians. They took the graves of their prophets as places of prostration. Two deens, religions, shall not coexist in the land of the Arabs." Al-Muwatta Hadith 45.18. Yahya related to me from Malik from Ibn Shihab that the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, said, "Two deens shall not coexist in the Arabian Peninsula." Malik said that Ibn Shihab said, Umar ibn al-Khattab searched for information about that until he was absolutely convinced that the Messenger of Allah, may Allah bless him and grant him peace, had said, "Two deens shall not coexist in the Arabian Peninsula," and he therefore expelled the Jews from Khaybar. In this, the 21st century, Christians in almost all the Muhammadan Muslim states are being persecuted and reduced in numbers through emigration. The most disgusting and disturbing fact is the deafening silence about this subject emanating from the media, the politicians, and the churches in the West.
Another mantra that fills the hadiths is Allah and His Apostle know best. Will you explain?
The above expression is repeated in the hadiths hundreds of times, implying and equating Muhammad with Allah in knowledge especially. In the Quran during the Meccan period, this mantra did not exist because it was towards the gods, Ar-Rahman or Allah alone, that his ideas were fixated. This changed after his arrival to Medina with his increasing political and military power, whereby the verses almost invariably associated Allah with his messenger. Muhammad's initial humility and humbleness were taken over by self-assertion and extreme arrogance, whereby he invariably linked his name to that of Allah, creating a subliminal twinning and an inseparable association in the minds of his impressionable, ignorant and gullible followers, as shown in only a few examples below. Sahih Muslim Hadith 6813, narrated by Abu Hurairah. We were in the company of Allah's Apostle and we heard a terrible sound. Thereupon Allah's Apostle said, "Do you know what sound is this?" We said, "Allah and His Apostle know best." Thereupon he said, "That is a stone which was thrown 70 years before in hell, and it has been constantly slipping down, and now it has reached its base." Sahih Muslim Hadith 790, narrated by Anas bin Malik. The Holy Prophet said, "Do you know what Kawthar is?" We said, "Allah and His Messenger know best." The Holy Prophet said, "It, Kawthar, is a canal which my Lord, the Exalted and Glorious, has promised me, and there is an abundance of good in it." Sahih Muslim Hadith 1768, narrated by Ubay ibn Ka'b. Allah Messenger said, "O Abu al-Mundhir, do you know the verse from the book of Allah which according to you is the greatest?" I said, "Allah and His Apostle know best." He again said, "Abu al-Mundhir, do you know the verse from the book of Allah which according to you is the greatest?" I said, "Allah, there is no God but He, the living, the eternal." Thereupon he struck me on my breast and said, "My knowledge be pleasant for you, O Abdul Munzir." Al-Muwatta Hadith 13.4. The Messenger of Allah took the Subh prayer with us at Hudaybiyah after it had rained in the night. When he had finished, he went up to the people and said, "Do you know what your Lord has said?" They said, "Allah and His Messenger know best." Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 7.850, narrated by Mu'ad bin Jabal. While I was riding behind the Prophet and between me and him there was only the back of the saddle, he said, "O Mu'ad," I replied, "Labbayka, O Allah's Apostle." He said, "Do you know what is Allah's right upon His slave?" I said, "Allah and His Apostle know best." He said, Allah's right upon his slaves is that they should worship him alone and not worship anything else besides him. Then he proceeded for a while and then said, O Mu'ad bin Jabal, I replied, Labbayka, O Allah's apostle. I said, do you know what is the right of the slaves upon Allah if they do that? I replied, Allah and his apostle know best. He said, the right of the slaves upon Allah is that he will not punish them if they do that. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 9.520 narrated by Abu Dahr. I entered the mosque while Allah's apostle was sitting there. When the sun had set, the Prophet said, O Abu Dahr, do you know where this sun goes? I said, Allah and his apostle know best. He said, it goes and asks permission to prostrate, and it is allowed, as if being ordered to return once it came, then it will rise from the west. Al-Tirmidhi Hadith 259, narrated by Anas bin Malik. Allah Messenger said, do you know who is most generous? They said, Allah and his Messenger know best. Whereupon he said, Allah is the most generous. Then I am most generous to mankind. And the most generous people after me would be those who will acquire knowledge and then disseminate it. Since neither Allah nor Gabriel ever addressed the followers of Muhammad, they, the gullible, superstitious and ignorant, had no choice but to accept Muhammad's statements as true, which of course they were not. The proofs that Muhammad was deceiving and betraying the trust of his followers are obvious from the very fact that his statements are totally self-serving and bereft of any logic, facts or knowledge. Muhammad is equal to Allah since Muhammad knows what Allah knows.
Why, if the Quran is the word of an omniscient God called Allah, was it revealed in 7 modes? Why 7 modes? Will you explain?
This is a question that every thinking and inquiring mind should ask, whether they are believers or unbelievers. After all, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, the scriptures of the great civilizations of India, China, Persia and others were all in one version. Why did Allah, if he were the same as the God of Israel and Jesus, need to reveal the Quran in not 2, 3 or 4 modes, but 7? Incredibly, the answer to this question, based upon the records of Muhammad and Islam, is astoundingly simple. To start with, the pagan Arabs were mostly illiterate and very rarely had the facilities or the wherewithal to put down in writing the verses of the Quran. Most of the Quran had to be memorized by those who were attending Muhammad at any one time. Since Muhammad had to inform some of his immediate followers of his alleged revelations at different times, in different places, to different companions, over the incredibly long period of 23 years, it was impossible for him to keep track of the verses, their contents, and to which surah they belonged. He was giving different versions of a verse to different companions at different times. This caused, of course, dissent, consternation, infighting, and bewilderment among his followers. When these companions exchanged recitations, each believing that he had the correct and obviously the only true version, they started fighting and accusing each other of error or fraud. They of course had no other recourse but to ask Muhammad for the true version. When Muhammad heard the 2 or more versions, he told them that all are correct. Muhammad escaped this dilemma by informing his gullible and ignorant followers that the Quran was revealed in 7 different ways, modes, versions or dialects. Thus, at a stroke, the sincere and truthful apostle of Allah covered all his lies and deception with this very simple but convenient answer. Why 7 modes? Because 7 is a holy number in the Bible, and hence Muhammad used it incessantly in the Quran and Hadith. Allah, who gave the Torah to Moses in only one form, had to give the glorious and inimitable Quran in 7 different ways. Our listeners should be reminded that many of the memorizers of the Quran perished in the earliest battles of Muhammad and Islam, before the Quran was finally collated and collected in book form. Hence, even according to the Hadiths, innumerable verses were lost in that way as well as in other ways, as detailed in our compilation of the Quran, chapter 36. Sahih Muslim Hadith 1787, narrated by Ubay ibn Ka'b. I was in the mosque when a man entered and prayed and recited the Quran in a style to which I objected. Then another man entered the mosque and recited in a style different from that of his companion. When we had finished the prayer, we all went to Allah's Messenger and said to him, "This man recited in a style to which I objected, and the other entered and recited in a style different from that of his companion." The Messenger of Allah asked them to recite, so they recited. He expressed approval of their efforts, and there occurred in my mind a sort of denial which did not occur even during the days of my ignorance. When the Messenger of Allah saw how I was affected, he struck my chest, whereupon I broke into a sweat and felt as though I were looking at Allah himself. He said to me, "Obey, a message was sent to me to recite the Quran in one dialect." And I replied, "Make things easy for my people." It was then conveyed to me for the second time that it should be recited in two dialects. I again replied to him, "Make affairs easy for my people." It was again conveyed to me for the third time to recite it in 7 modes. It is obvious then that Muhammad's Allah was incapable of knowing that the followers of Muhammad were such simpletons that they needed the Quran to be recited in 7 different ways for them to comprehend it. Muhammad's all-knowing Allah did not know their weaknesses. No truly divine supreme being could fail to know the weaknesses of his own creation. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 3.601, narrated by Umar ibn al-Khattab. I heard Hisham bin Hakam bin Hizam reciting Surah Al-Furqan in a way different to that of mine. Allah's Apostle had taught it to me in a different way. So I was about to quarrel with him, but I waited till he finished. Then I tied his garment round his neck and seized him by it and brought him to Allah's Apostle and said, "I have heard him reciting Surah Al-Furqan in a way different to the way you taught it to me." The Prophet ordered me to release him and asked Hisham to recite it. When he recited it, Allah's Apostle said, "It was revealed in this way." Then he asked me to recite it. When I recited it, he said, "It was revealed in this way also." The Quran has been revealed in 7 different ways, so recite it in the way that is easier for you. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 4.442, narrated by Ibn Abbas. Allah's Apostle said, "Gabriel read the Quran to me in one way, and I continued asking him to read it in different ways till he read it in 7 different ways." Al-Tirmidhi Hadith 2215, narrated by Ubay ibn Ka'b. Ubay told of Allah's Messenger meeting Gabriel and saying, "I have been sent, Gabriel, to a people who are unlettered, among whom are old women and old men, boys and girls, and men who have never read a book." He replied, "The Quran, Muhammad, has been sent down in 7 modes." Ladies and gentlemen, please remember that the people of the book, the Israelites, when they left Egypt, were also unlettered. But the God of Israel did not need to recite the Torah to them in 7 different ways. It was exactly because of these various versions of the Quran that Uthman bin Affan, the 3rd Khalifa, allowed only one Quran to exist by burning the 6 other versions. Since Muhammad accepted and allowed the 7 variations of the Quran as agreed upon with Allah through Gabriel, no mortal should have had the right to burn any of them, as each one was supposedly divine. This unilateral act of his caused a rebellion and dissension among the Arabs that ended with his murder. This sacrilegious act nullifies the unfounded and totally spurious claims of the followers of Muhammad that the Quran was never changed or tampered with. In defiance of the reports in most of the books written by the earlier Muhammadan exegetes that show otherwise. All the above illogical, sacrilegious and unacceptable anomalies can be instantly resolved when our listeners realize that the Quran in its entirety is a product of Muhammad's imagination, his own alter ego, but cleverly projected into the unsuspecting mouth of Allah, the supreme rock god of the Quraysh, thus giving his alleged revelations the authority of divine sanctity.
From my own studies of the subject, it seems that nothing whatsoever has changed in the relationship between Mohammedan Islam and the news media over the last 1400 years. Do you agree?
Your observation is of course accurate, since the followers of Muhammad are actually his clones. They have no choice as believers but to follow in his footsteps. His sunnah and ape and imitate all his actions, thoughts and deeds, since he is supposed to be the most perfect male human being in all creation. Our listeners should be made aware that the only news media among the tribes of Arabia were their poets. It was they who memorized the lineage of the tribe, its history, its deeds, and its myths. They were the ones who, by their poetry and or oratory, disseminated the current affairs of their day. The poets of the tribe were held in immense esteem and awe, since an excellent poet of a small tribe could be more lethal than all the forces of a bigger tribe with a mediocre poet. Poets invariably extolled the virtues of their tribe or those of certain individuals, be they ordinary men or kings. At the annual fair of Ukaz, held during the forbidden months, poets vied with each other in public contests that could bring great honor to them and their tribe when they won. Among the ancient Arabian odes, 7 were legendary and held first place and were called mu'allaqat, meaning suspended. They were magnificent poems composed by some of the most illustrious poets of Arabia long before Muhammad. In the Arab world, they are honored as masterpieces of poetical composition. The days before Islam are called in Arabic al-Jahiliyyah, meaning the time of ignorance or barbarity. However, it was during this alleged time of ignorance that many of the best and most beautiful Arabic poetry were conceived, a fact recognized even by the Muhammadan Muslims themselves. No poets during the whole period of pagan Arabia were murdered for their poetry. This would have been unthinkable and almost sacrilegious. Unfortunately, Muhammad changed all these rules and prohibitions because they did not suit him or his agenda. As will be shown in the following ahadith, Muhammad sanctions the murder and assassination of any and all those who satirized or disagreed with him and his ideas. He instigated their butchery, be they men or women, free or slave, young or old. He exhibits a pathological and depraved indifference to human suffering, human rights, justice, and morality. Those of his followers who were willing to commit these crimes at his prompting did so with incredible cowardice, invariably against unarmed civilians in the dead of night. Muhammad was an equal opportunity destroyer of all those who did not accept his belief system. Even today, in the 21st century, his followers exhibit exactly the same symptoms all over the world. Ibn Ishaq 597. When the apostle returned to Medina after his raid on Taif, word spread that he killed some of the men who had satirized and insulted him. The poets were left spread in all directions. Ka'b al-Ashraf began publishing poems about the wives of the Muslims. He referred to the wives of Muslims and damaging their honor. In other poems, he would curse the poet, ridicule him, and say improper things about him. In a third type of poem, he would curse the Prophet's companions and compare them to animals, dogs, sheep, and camels. This was a type of insult. The Arabs of those times loved poetry. As the verse says, poetry is the language of the Arabs. For Arabs, poetry is sharper than the sword. Ishaq 368. Ka'b's body was left prostrate, humble in submission. Sword in hand, we cut him down. By Muhammad's order, we were sent secretly by night. Brother killing brother. We lured him to his death with guile, cunning, and deviousness. Traveling by night, bold as lions, we went into his home. We made him taste death with our deadly swords. We sought victory for the religion of the Prophet. We carried Ka'b's head and brought it to Muhammad during the night. We saluted him as he stood praying and told him that we had slain Allah's enemy. When he came out to us, we cast Ashraf's head before his feet. The Prophet praised Allah that the poet had been assassinated and complimented us on the good work we had done in Allah's cause. Again and again and again, the degree of cowardice and duplicity exhibited by Muhammad and his followers is unbelievable. They always murdered, assassinated, or slaughtered their defenseless and unsuspecting victims, invariably unarmed civilians, but at the same time boasted that they were bold as lions. Even today, 1400 years later, nothing whatsoever has changed in the character of the male Muhammadan Muslims. They still butcher their manacled and defenseless victims on television while boasting about their own bravery. Ishaq 676. Asma bint Marwan, the poetess, in protest over the cowardly assassination of Ka'b al-Ashraf, said to her people, "You obey a stranger who encourages you to murder for booty. You are greedy men. Is there no honor among you?" Upon hearing those lines, Muhammad said, "Will no one rid me of this woman?" Umayr, a zealous Muslim, decided to execute the Prophet's wishes. That very night, he crept into the writer's home while she lay sleeping surrounded by her young children. There was one at her breast. Umayr removed the suckling babe and then plunged his sword into the poet. The next morning in the mosque, Muhammad, who was aware of the assassination, said, "You have helped Allah and His Apostle." Umayr said, "She had 5 sons. Should I feel guilty?" "No," the Prophet said. "Killing her was as meaningless as 2 goats butting heads." No prophet in recorded human history ever acted with such depraved, pathological indifference towards other human beings. Muhammad is the only alleged, divinely inspired messenger who acted in such manner. Only after studying in depth the subjects of the Quran, Ahadith, Arab and Islamic history could one come to the one and only logical conclusion that explains all the hate-mongering, warmongering, immorality, injustices, inconsistencies, absurdities, historical dislocation, theological contortions, grammatical errors, mendacities and stupidities that fill the Quran and Hadiths, which is that every letter, every word, every verse ayah, and every chapter surah in the Quran could not have been revealed by any omniscient, compassionate, and merciful divinity, because it is in reality the product of Muhammad's own ideas, hatreds, lusts, anger, jealousy, fears, cowardice, and immorality. In other words, his own alter ego, but cleverly projected into the unsuspecting mouth of Allah, the pagan Arabian supreme rock god of the Quraysh, embedded into the corner wall of the Kaaba called the Black Stone. In a nutshell, Muhammad, Gabriel, Satan, and Allah are one and the same. They are all manifestations of Muhammad's own invented personal cult belief system.
While reading Ibn Ishaq's Sirat Rasul Allah and the Hadiths, I came upon hundreds of instances of events or actions that were taken or ordered by Muhammad, for which only afterwards a revelation was descended, justifying or explaining it by an indisputable divine decree. Can you explain this?
Your observations are correct, and any of our listeners who may have doubts need only go to our website to get many more examples and details. There are literally hundreds of such examples, and I can only recite a few of them that very clearly prove the depth of Muhammad's deception, which he willfully and knowingly perpetrated against his believing but very gullible followers. Sahih Bukhari Hadith 6.318, narrated by Aisha. Sauda, the wife of the Prophet, went out to answer the call of nature after it was made obligatory for all the Muslim ladies to observe the veil. She was a fat, huge lady, and everybody who knew her could recognize her. So Umar ibn al-Khattab saw her and said, "O Sauda, by Allah, you cannot hide yourself from us. So think of a way by which you should not be recognized on going out." Sauda returned while Allah's Apostle was in my house taking his supper, and a bone covered with meat was in his hand. She entered and said, "O Allah's Apostle, I went out to answer the call of nature, and Umar said to me so and so." Then Allah inspired him. And when the state of inspiration was over, the bone was still in his hand, as he had not put it down. He said to Sauda, "You women have been allowed to go out for your needs." Even to attend to the call of nature, the women needed dispensation and the divine revelation that was instantly attended to while Muhammad was still having his supper by the ever-accommodating Allah, the alleged creator of the universe. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 6.175, narrated by Ibn Abbas. When the verse, "If there are 20 steadfast amongst you, they will overcome 200, was revealed, then it became obligatory for the Muslims that one Muslim should not flee from 10 non-Muslims. Then there was revealed, "But now Allah has lightened your task. So it became obligatory that 100 Muslims should not flee before 200 non-Muslims. It seems that Muhammad's Allah, the Omniscient, the All-Knowing, did not realize that one believer could not possibly fight against 10 unbelievers. So Allah corrected this error and revealed another verse, which overruled the earlier one, thus reducing the odds to the more realistic of one believer being equal to only 2 unbelievers. Sahih al-Bukhari Hadith 6.311 narrated by Aisha. I used to look down upon those ladies who had given themselves to Allah's apostle, and I used to say, can a lady give herself to a man? But when Allah revealed, you, O Muhammad, can postpone the turn of whom you will, of them, your wives, and you may receive any of them whom you will, and there is no blame on you if you invite one whose turn you have set aside temporarily. Chapter 33.51, I said to the Prophet, I feel that your Lord hastens in fulfilling all your wishes and desires. Even his teenage wife Aisha was perplexed at the alacrity with which Allah very conveniently accommodated Muhammad's wishes and desires whenever he required them. Sunan Abu Dawood Hadith 2304 narrated by Jabir and Abdullah Musayyakh. A slave girl of some Ansari came and said, my master forces me to commit fornication. Thereupon the following verse was revealed, but force not your maids to prostitution when they desire chastity. Sunan Abu Dawood 3960 narrated by Abdullah ibn Abbas. The verse, and no prophet could ever be false to his trust, was revealed about a red velvet. When it was found missing on the day of Badr, some people said, perhaps the apostle of Allah has taken it. So Allah, the Exalted, sent down, and no prophet could ever be false to his trust, to the end of the verse. Even his followers suspected that he may have cheated them, for which Muhammad shut them up with the conveniently revealed verse exonerating him. Ibn Ishaq, page 288, the Quraysh said, Muhammad and his companions have violated the sacred month, shed blood therein, taken booty and captured men. So Allah sent down to his apostle Al-Baqarah 2.217. They asked thee concerning fighting in the prohibited month, say, fighting therein is a grave offense. But graver is it in the sight of Allah to prevent access to the path of Allah, to deny him, to prevent access to the sacred mosque and drive out its members. Tumult and oppression are worse than slaughter. One does not have to be a scholar or a rocket scientist to realize that there is something unusual and unsavory about Muhammad's claim that all his revelations were divinely inspired, when in fact, based upon all the above stories alone, not one of them could have been. Each one of these stories and hundreds more in both the Quran and other hadiths prove beyond a reasonable doubt that they were all made to order revelations authored by Muhammad as and when he needed them, and then very cleverly projected them into the unsuspecting mouth of Allah, the supreme rock god of the Quraysh, to give them divine sanctification. The most shocking and disturbing realization from all of the above is the inescapable conclusion that the author of the Quran was Muhammad, and that in reality Allah, Gabriel and Satan are Muhammad's multiple personalities, as clearly demonstrated in almost every verse of the Quran. That is why that even among the most learned followers of Muhammad, it is impossible for any of them to admit these facts, because such an admission would destroy and completely discredit Muhammad, his Quran, and the whole of Muhammadan Islam.
The followers of Muhammad and their supporters in the news media, and among many politicians, tell the world that Muhammadan Islam is egalitarian, tolerant, just and moral, that it does not discriminate against the people of the book, the Christians and the Jews. Since most of the people in the world are ignorant of the contents of the Quran, they tend to believe these lies.
Your observations and remarks are correct, and I would like our listeners to be made aware of the following very relevant points before I go into the details. That according to the hadiths, the earliest followers of Muhammad who were allegedly being persecuted by the pagan Quraysh tribe to which Muhammad belonged escaped to Abyssinia, where the Christian king gave them shelter and safety. That when Muhammad was a child of 12 on a trip to Syria, he met a Christian monk called Bahira, who allegedly asserted that Muhammad was the promised prophet. That the Christian uncle of Muhammad's first wife, Khadija, also allegedly asserted that he was the promised prophet. When Muhammad and his followers escaped from Mecca to Medina from the wrath of the pagan Quraysh, the Judaized Arab tribes of the Medina welcomed him as a brother monotheist, leading the Arabs away from paganism. It was while Muhammad was in the Medina among the Judaized Arabs that he instructed his followers to observe their Yom Kippur, day of fasting, called Ashura, as it fell on the 10th day of Muharram. It was also while he was in Medina that he instructed his followers to observe the Qibla of the Judaized Arabs, that is, to pray towards the direction of Jerusalem. It was also while he was among the Judaized Arab in Medina that many of the most important legal, moral, temporal and ritual rules of the Quran were allegedly revealed to him by Gabriel. He filled his Quran with an impressive number of stories, events and traditions that were plagiarized, pirated, plundered and or perverted almost verbatim from the non-canonical Hebrew and Christian scriptures, as we have shown in several chapters of our series. Muhammad's debt, both moral and religious, to the people of the book is not only immense, but it is also incontrovertible. Muhammad's infatuation with the people of the book turned into hatred when they rejected his claims that he was the Prophet of Allah, who was sent to convert not only the pagans, but them also. At this, they had to draw the line. Since what Muhammad was offering in his Quran had absolutely nothing to compare with what the people of the book already had, they obviously were not willing to accept his dictates and presumptions. Muhammad was now like a rejected suitor, who had no doubt whatsoever in his own self-asserted grandiosity and claims to prophethood, and hence reacted with immense hatred and violence against the people of the book. He did so through his usual allegedly revealed verses by the angel Gabriel, hence giving his hatred and ill thoughts the power of sanctity. His Surah At-Tawbah, number 9, in numerous verses, he recites his litany of hate-mongering and war-mongering thoughts against the pagans as well as against the people of the book. Al-Tawbah 9.5. But when the forbidden months are past, then fight and slay the pagans wherever you find them, and seize them, beleaguer them, and lie in wait for them in every stratagem of war. Fight them, and Allah will punish them by your hands. Say, if it be that your fathers, your sons, your brothers, your mates, or your kindred, the wealth that you have gained, the commerce in which you fear a decline, or the dwellings in which you delight, are dearer to you than Allah or His Apostle, or the striving in His cause, then wait until Allah brings about His decision, and Allah guides not the rebellious. Our listeners, please notice the transition of Allah or His Apostle, which makes Muhammad equal in importance to Allah. Al-Tawbah 9:29. Fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which has been forbidden by Allah and His Apostle, nor acknowledge the religion of truth, even if they are of the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves humiliated. The translator of the Quran explains this verse as follows. Jizya, the root meaning is compensation. The derived meaning, which became the technical meaning, was a poll tax levied from those who did not accept Islam, but were willing to live under the protection of Islam, and were thus tacitly willing to submit to its ideals being enforced in the Muslim state. There was no amount permanently fixed for it. It was in acknowledgement that those whose religion was tolerated would in their turn not interfere with the preaching and progress of Islam. Ladies and gentlemen, please be aware that the jizya was an onerous tax, in many cases amounting to almost 50% of the income of the people of the book, levied against them in their own subjugated lands to protect them. To protect them from whom? Or from what? The explanation given by the translator is bereft of logic or morality, and adds insult to injury to the people of the book. Moreover, even as they pay this egregious tax, they are to be humiliated and reminded of their inferior status under the sword of Muhammad and Islam in their own conquered homelands. It was to escape these debilitating taxes and humiliations that hundreds of thousands of the subjugated peoples converted to Muhammadan Islam. 9.33. It is he who hath sent his apostle with guidance and religion of truth to proclaim it over all religions, even though the pagans may detest it. There is no ambiguity regarding the supremacist meaning of over all religions. Believing that they are predestined to conquer the world, the Arabs and Muhammadan Muslims went to war against all the surrounding civilization to mass murder, enslave, plunder, rape, destroy, and dehumanize millions of people. They did so on a colossal scale, on 3 continents covering almost 10 million square miles, slaughtering and enslaving hundreds of millions of people in the name of Allah. Al-Imran 3.56. As for those disbelieving infidels, Jews, Christians, and pagans, I will punish them with a terrible agony in this world and the next. They have no one to help them or save them. If anyone disputes with you about Jesus being divine, flee them and pray that Allah will curse them. O you who believe, take not into your intimacy those outside your religion, Jews and Christians and pagans. They will not fail to corrupt you. This verse is one among hundreds that discriminate, incite hatred, and vilify all the humans who do not believe as the Muhammadans do in Allah and Muhammad as his messenger. Al-Ma'idah 5.51. O ye who believe, take not the Jews and Christians for your friends and protectors. Our listeners should not need many more such vile verses to be convinced of Muhammad's Qur'an's racism, hate-mongering, and discriminatory attributes. Al-Ma'idah 5.57. Believers, take not for friends those who take your religion for a mockery or sport, a joke, whether among those who receive the scripture before you or among those who reject faith but fear Allah. The people of the book had every legitimate reason for their mockery and sarcasm of the Quran because Muhammad was trying his best at making the Quran sound historical, spiritual, authoritative, and divine through a continuous methodology of plagiarizing, plundering, pirating, and or perverting concepts, precepts, thoughts, and ideas from their scriptures, their fetishes, their traditions, as well as those of the Zoroastrians and the pagan Arabs, all the time pretending that they were new revelations. The people of the book, as well as his own Quraysh tribe, knew better, and in the end he resolved to destroy them since they were the only witnesses to his mendacity and deception. 5.72. They do blaspheme who say Allah is Christ, the son of Maryam. They are surely disbelievers, kafara, who blaspheme and say Allah is one of 3 in the Trinity, for there is no God, ilah, except one God, ilah. If they desist not from saying this blasphemy, verily a grievous penalty will befall them. The disbelievers will suffer a painful doom. The Quran and the believing followers of Muhammad consider all Christians who believe in the divinity of Jesus as kafara, unbelievers, equal to the hated pagans, and hence subject to the choices of conversion, subjugation, or death. All those Christians who think that they can be friends with believing Muhammadans are deceiving themselves, since the few verses of the Quran that we have so far quoted, without even referring to more of them in the hadiths, prove otherwise. For those believers and unbelievers who would like to learn much more about the status of the people of the book under Muhammadan Muslim rule, we recommend the very best in this subject, Dhimmis and Dhimmitude by the author Bat Ye'or. Ladies and gentlemen, believers and unbelievers, the debate and arguments about the authenticity and the alleged divine origin of the Quran goes on and will continue to do so interminably. Although our series does its best to show, in part after part, based entirely upon the Arabic language of the Quran and Hadith, their own books, recorded history and theology, that the Muhammadan circular logic in defense of their position is untenable, nonetheless, they persist in their arguments of denial, while in the meantime attacking our veracity by using abusive language and by threatening us. So we have decided that we should all with our God-given or nature-given thinking abilities, scrutinize a short list of the internal and external self-evident contradictions in the Quran and Hadiths, and once and for all put to rest the usual Muhammadan Muslim arguments that are repeated by the ignorant news media and ignoble politicians and the academia, which assert that Islam means peace, when in fact in Arabic language of the Quran, Islam means submission. That Islam belongs to the followers of Muhammad only, when in fact this is one of the greatest linguistic and religious deceptions that has ever been perpetrated upon humanity. Since according to the Quran itself, any human being who believes in the one and only God is automatically a Muslim, and has absolutely nothing to do with either Muhammad or his Quran. That Muhammadan Islam is tolerant when any reasonable person reading the Quran and observing current events should conclude otherwise. That Allah revealed the Torah to Moses directly, Kalimullah, and yet they claim, without a single proof, that the Torah that we have today had been perverted by the Jews. That Allah revealed the Gospels to Jesus, when we know, based upon the historical record, that this is not the case, since the Gospels were written decades after the death of Jesus. That the Gospels that we have today had also been perverted by the Christians this time, when no follower of Muhammad can ever prove these allegations. That the Quran that we have today is exactly the same, unaltered, as the one that Muhammad transmitted to his followers, when the Muhammadan records themselves, as we have shown, and will continue to show, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that this is a fallacy. That the same God revealed the Bible and the Quran, when in fact this is an impossibility, since the Quran contradicts the Bible in every verse or ayah. That mankind was created from either a clot or a leech, when the Bible tells us that it is descended from Adam, who was created from dust. That Allah said, "Be," to Adam, and he was. Whereas the Bible asserts that the Almighty breathed into the nostrils of Adam and gave him life. That Adam and Eve ate from the tree of life, when in the Bible it is crystal clear that they ate from the tree of knowledge. That it was Satan who deceived Adam and Eve, whereas the Torah has no concept of Satan and mentions the serpent instead. That Adam and Eve were thrown down from the Garden of Eden in heaven to earth, while in the biblical original they were thrown out of it on earth. That the number of days of creation are 8, while the biblical version states that they are only 6. That there were 7 heavens created when only 1 is mentioned in the Bible. That the sun, which is 1,000,000 times bigger than the earth, sets in a puddle of murky water, when humanity has known this to be untrue. That Haman was the prime minister of Pharaoh the Egyptian at the time of Moses, when we recognize him as the prime minister of Xerxes the Persian at the time of Esther 1,000 years earlier. That Pharaoh commanded Haman to build the Tower of Babel in Egypt, when according to the Bible it was built in Babylon in modern-day Iraq. That the Quran asserts that it was Allah himself who chose the Israelites above all other people, and yet the Muhammad has condemned the Jews for calling themselves the chosen people and labeled them racists. That actually it was Allah in the Quran who promised the land to the Israelites, but the Arabs nonetheless claim it to be theirs. That the Quran states that Muhammad was predicted in the Torah, when we have shown that this is a lie. That the Quran states that Muhammad was predicted in the New Testament also, when we have proven that this is a deliberate perversion of language. That Muhammad in his alleged night journey landed in Jerusalem, when in fact the name of Jerusalem is never mentioned in the Quran, while it appears 667 times in the Bible. That Muhammad saw Moses, who had died at least 2,100 years earlier, praying in his grave, when resurrection of the dead has not yet occurred. That Allah is merciful and compassionate, when in fact He is neither, since He predestines humanity to be either believers and go to paradise, or be disbelievers and end up in hell. By depriving humanity of any free will, thereby having no choice in the matter, they are actually innocent of their preordained actions, showing Allah to be immoral and unjust, clearly not merciful or compassionate. That Muhammad was a prophet, when they cannot point to a single prophecy anywhere on the Quran. that the hadiths enumerate a great number of unsubstantiated and impossible miracles that were performed by Muhammad, thus contradicting the Quran, which asserts otherwise. That Muhammad had knowledge of all subjects, from astronomy to mathematics, when all the relevant verses of the Quran and hadith show his incredible ignorance and naivety. That Muhammad was the last of the prophets, when we have demonstrated this to be a deliberate misrepresentation and perversion of the meaning of the word khatam, thus disproving the allegation. That Muhammad was sinless when the Arabic of both the Quran and the Hadiths assert otherwise. That Adam, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, etc. knew Allah, when in fact the name Allah does not appear anywhere in the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament, since it was the Arabic name of the God of the pagan Arabs. That it was Ishmael who was being sacrificed by Abraham, while the original story in the Bible asserts repeatedly and unambiguously that it was in fact Isaac. That Abraham and Ishmael built the foundations of the Kaaba in Arabia, when in reality the names Allah, Arab, Arabia, Mecca and Kaaba are never mentioned in the Torah, and neither Abraham nor Ishmael had ever set foot in Arabia. That the angel Gabriel was the same who appeared to Abraham, Moses and Jesus, when anyone who has read the Bible would know this is untrue. That the mother of Jesus, Mary, is the same as Maryam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, from 1400 years earlier. That Mary gave birth to Jesus under a palm tree, while the Gospels are totally ignorant of such an event. That Jesus did not die on the cross, thus denying his resurrection, and thereby, with a single sentence, completely destroying the very foundation of Christianity. That Abraham, Jacob, Ishmael, Isaac, Moses, the Israelites, Jesus, Mary, and the apostles, all of whom incidentally are Hebrews, Israelites, or Jews, were all Muslims, meaning believers in the one and only God, yet the followers of Muhammad have falsely arrogated this title only to themselves, so that they can discriminate, humiliate, and subjugate the people of the book. That the Quran states that the Jews, who have been and are the most ardent monotheists, allegedly believe that the Uzair is the son of God, thus making them kafara and unbelievers, when it is impossible for anyone to substantiate such an obscene lie. That the Quran was a book revealed to Muhammad, when all the records of Muhammad and Islam prove this is to be a falsehood, since the Quran was compiled into book form only after Muhammad was dead. That Muhammad and Islam is a religion, when in fact it is the cult of Muhammad, since his followers must emulate his sunnah. That Muhammadan Muslims have various beliefs and traditions, when in reality they are entirely based upon perverted, contorted, and twisted historical and religious events, as shown in our series. That jihad is a spiritual struggle, when all the verses of the Quran and Hadiths clearly depict it otherwise. The ultimate goal of all male followers of Muhammad is to die fighting all unbelievers, fi sabilillah, that is, for the sake of Allah. It is actually considered the sixth pillar of Muhammadan Islam. And in the ultimate of circular logic of Muhammadan Islam, it is Allah in his infinite wisdom and compassion who has predestined certain believers to righteously massacre and slaughter all unbelievers, whom Allah also predestined as such in the first place. Ladies and gentlemen, it is common knowledge that the Almighty, by whatever name we may give him, must be all-knowing, that is, omniscient, as well as infallible, merciful, and compassionate. Blasphemously, the Quran proves that Allah, if Allah were God, is otherwise uncertain, vacillating, fallible, merciless, immoral, and unjust. There are hundreds more of such differences and inconsistencies between the Quran and the Bible. As far as we know, based upon all the above information, we have very limited choices in trying to understand how this is possible. How the divine, who allegedly revealed the Quran, can be so wrong and so full of hate. You, our listeners, have the freedom to make up your own mind and conclusions. We, nonetheless, would like to share our own conclusions with you. In our opinion, we believe that the answer is very simple. Since it is illogical to accept that any omniscient, merciful, and compassionate God would have revealed all the discrepancies, hate-mongering, war-mongering, discrimination, racism, hypocrisy, grammatical errors, as well as the historical and character dislocations, mendacities, abnormalities, inconsistencies, time and space displacements that permeate the verses and chapters of the Quran, then only one conclusion can be possible: that every letter, every word, every verse, ayah, and every chapter, surah in the Quran are the product of Muhammad's personal thoughts and imaginings, his own hatreds, anger, lust, jealousy, fears, envy, and incomprehension. They are totally the secretions of his mind based upon his distorted recollections of stories and tales he had heard in earlier times from Jewish and Christian individuals. In summation, they actually represent his own alter ego, cleverly projected into the unsuspecting mouth of Allah, the supreme pagan rock god of Mecca, embedded into the corner wall of the Kaaba, called the Black Stone. The major players in the Quran, Muhammad, Allah, Gabriel, and Satan, are actually one and the same. They are all Muhammad himself, while Allah, Gabriel, and Satan are mere props required to give his alleged revelation sanctity and divine authority. After 13 years of preaching to his own tribe and relatives among his pagan Arab audience, consisting mostly of illiterate, superstitious, unlearned, and gullible people, even so, less than 100 of them swallowed Muhammad's claims and posturing for prophethood. Muhammad was not able to convince even most of his own kith and kin of his claims as the messenger of Allah, let alone the more educated, Judaized, and Christianized Arabians who knew that every ethical, judicial, and moral precept, concept, thought, or idea in the Quran had been plagiarized, plundered, pirated, and or perverted from their Bible and scriptures. In the end, he had to use terror, bribery, and slaughter to bring them all under his control and force them to submit to him. There is, in the final analysis, absolutely nothing divine about the Quran. And any follower of Muhammad, anywhere on this planet, who would attempt to challenge these statements and conclusions based entirely on the Muhammadan records themselves, will have the same probability of success as finding a snowflake in Muhammad's inferno.